so anyone walking by would not see their faces. "That was close," Violet sighed in relief, when a group of chatting doctors had gone by without even glancing at the youngsters. "It was close," Klaus agreed, "and we don't want it to get any closer. I don't think we should get back on the van at the end of the day or any other day. Sooner or later we're bound to be recognized." "You're right," Violet said. "We'd have to walk back through the hospital every day just to get to the van. But where will we go at night? People will think it is odd if 3 children are sleeping in the Library of Records." "Half," Sunny suggested. "That's a pretty good idea," Violet replied. "We could sleep in the unfinished half of the hospital. Nobody will go there at night." "Sleep all by ourselves in a half-finished room?" Klaus asked. "It'll be cold and dark." "It can't be much worse than the orphan shack at Prufrock Prep," Violet said. "Danya," Sunny said, which meant, or the bedroom at Count Olaf's house. Klaus shuddered, remembering how terrible it was when Count Olaf had been their guardian. "You're right," he said, stopping at a door which read Library of Records. "The unfinished wing of the hospital can't be that bad." The Baudelaires knocked on the door, which opened almost immediately to reveal one of the oldest men they had ever met, wearing one of the tiniest pairs of glasses they had ever seen. Each lens was scarcely bigger than a green pea, and the man had to squint in order to look at them.
"My eyesight isn't what it used to be," he said. "But you appear to be children, and you're very familiar children, too. I'm certain I've seen your faces somewhere before."
The Baudelaires looked at one another in panic, not knowing whether to dash out of the room or to try to convince the man he was mistaken. "We're new volunteers," Violet said. "I don't think we've ever met before." "Babs assigned us to work in the Library of Records," Klaus said.
"Well, you've come to the right place,"
the old man said with a wrinkled smile.
"My name is Hal, and I've worked here in the Library of Records for more years than I'd like to count. I'm afraid my eyesight isn't what it used to be, so I asked Babs if some volunteers could help me." "Wolik,"
Sunny said. "My sister says we're very happy to be of assistance," Violet said. "And we are."
"Well, I'm glad to hear that," Hal said, "because there's a lot of work to be done. Come on in, and I'll explain what you have to do."
The Baudelaires walked through the door and found themselves in a small room with nothing much in it but a small table that held a bowl of fresh fruit. "This is the library?" Klaus said.
"Oh, no,"
the man said.
"This is just an antechamber, a small room I'm using to store my fruit. If you get hungry during the day, you may help yourself to something out of that bowl. Also, this is where the intercom is, so we'll have to report here whenever Babs makes an announcement."
He led them across the room to a small door and took a loop of string out of the pocket of his coat. On the loop of string were hundreds of keys, which made tiny clanging noises as they jostled one another. Hal quickly found the right key to unlock the door.
"This," he said with a small smile, "is the Library of Records."
Hal ushered the children inside a dim room with very low ceilings, so low that Hal's grey hair almost brushed against the top. But although the room was not very tall, it was enormous. The Library of Records stretched out so far in front of the Baudelaires that they could scarcely see the opposite wall, or, as the children looked from side to side, the right and left walls. All they could see were big metal file cabinets with neatly labelled drawers describing the files contained inside. The file cabinets were placed in row after row, as far as the eye could see. The rows were placed very close together, so that the siblings had to walk behind Hal in single file as he gave them the tour of the room.
I've organized everything myself, he explained. The Library of Records contains information not only from Heimlich Hospital, but from all over the area. There's information about everything from poetry to pills, from picture frames to pyramids, from pudding to psychology, and that's just in the P aisle, which we're walking down right now.
What an amazing place, Klaus said. Just think of everything we can learn from reading all these files.
No, Hal said, shaking his head sternly. We're supposed to file this information, not read it. I don't want to see you touching any of these files except when you're working with them. That's why I keep all these file cabinets locked up tight. Now, let me show you exactly where you'll be working.
Hal led them to the far wall and pointed out a small rectangular hole, just wide enough for Sonny or maybe Klaus to crawl through. Beside the hole was a basket with a large stack of paper in it and a bowl filled with paper clips.
Authorities deposit information into the information chute, which begins outside the hospital and ends right here, he explained. And I need 2 people to help me file these deposits in the right place. Here's what you do. First, you remove the paper clips and put them in this bowl. Then you glance at the information and figure out where it goes. Remember, try to read as little as possible.
He paused, unclipped a small stack of paper, and squinted at the top page.
For instance, he continued, you only have to read a few words to see that the paragraphs are about the weather last week at Damocles Dock, which is on the shore of some lake someplace. So you would ask me to unlock cabinets in aisle D for Damocles, or W for weather, or even P for paragraphs. It's your choice.
But won't it be difficult for people to find that information again? Klaus asked. They won't know whether to look under D, W, or P.
Then I'll have to look under all 3 letters,
Hal said.
Sometimes the information you need is not in the most obvious place. Remember, paperwork is the most important thing we do at this hospital, so your job is very important. Do you think you can file these papers correctly? I'd like you to start right away.
I think we can, Violet said. But what will the 3rd volunteer do? Hal looked embarrassed and held up the loop of string with all the keys on it.
I lost some of the keys to the file cabinets, he admitted, and I need someone to use some sort of sharp object to open them up. Me, Sonny said.
My sister means that she'd be perfect for that job because she has very sharp teeth, Violet explained.
Your sister?
Hal said, and scratched his head.
Somehow I knew you 3 children were from the same family. I'm certain I was just reading some information about you.
The children looked at one another again and felt a nervous flutter in their stomachs. Do you read the Daily Punctilio? Klaus asked carefully.
Of course not,
Hal said with a frown.
That newspaper is the worst I've ever seen. Nearly every story they print is an absolute lie.
The Baudelaire smiled in relief. We can't tell you how happy we are to hear that, Violet said. Well, I guess we'd better get to work.
Yes,
Hal said.
Come on, little one. I'll show you where the locked cabinets are, and you 2 start filing. I just wish I could remember.
The old man's voice trailed off, and then he snapped his fingers and grinned. There are many reasons, of course, why someone might snap their fingers and grin. If you heard some pleasing music, for instance, you might snap your fingers and grin to demonstrate that the music had charms that could soothe your savage breast. If you were employed as a spy, you might snap your fingers and grin in order to deliver a message in secret snapping and grinning code. But you might also snap your fingers and grin if you had been trying hard to remember something and had suddenly succeeded. Hal was not listening to music in the Library of Records, and after 9 months, 6 days, and 14 hours of research, I can say with reasonable certainty that Hal was not employed as a spy, so it would be sensible to conclude he had just remembered something.
I just remembered something,
he said.
I know why you three seem so familiar.
Hal continued to lead Sunny down another aisle of file cabinets to show her where her teeth could be handy, so his voice floated over to the 2 older Baudelaires as if he was speaking on an intercom.
I didn't read it, of course, but there was some information about you in the file, about the Snicket files.
Chapter 5. I just don't understand it, said Klaus, which was not something he said very often. Violet nodded in agreement, and then said something she didn't say very frequently either. It's a puzzle I'm not sure we can solve.
Pietri Sycamolo via Del Recchio to Mexity,
Sunny said, which was something she had said only once before. It meant something along the lines of, I must admit I don't have the faintest idea of what is going on. And the first time the youngest Baudelaire had said it, she had just been brought home from the hospital where she was born, and was looking at her siblings as they leaned over her crib to greet her. This time she was sitting in the unfinished wing of the hospital where she worked, and was looking at her siblings as they tried to guess what Hal had meant when he had mentioned the Snicket fires. If I had been with the children, I would have been able to tell them a long and terrible story about men and women who joined a noble organization only to find their lives wrecked by a greedy man and a lazy newspaper. But the siblings were alone, and all they had of the story were a few pages from the Quagmire notebooks. It was night, and after working all day in the Library of Records, the Baudelaire orphans had made themselves as comfortable as they could in the half-finished section of Heimlich Hospital, but I am sorry to say the phrase, as comfortable as they could, here means not very comfortable at all. Violet had found a few flashlights designed to be used by builders working in dark corners, but when she arranged them to light up their surroundings, the light only made clear just how filthy their surroundings really were. Klaus had found some drop cloths designed to be used by painters who did not want to drip paint on the floor, but when he wrapped them around himself and his sisters, the warmth only made clear just how freezing it was when the evening wind blew through the sheets of plastic that were nailed to the wooden boards. And Sunny had used her teeth to chop up some of the fruit in Hal's bowl to make a sort of fruit salad for dinner. But each handful of chopped fruit only made clear just how inappropriate it was to be living in such a bare and lonely place. But even though it was clear to the children how filthy, freezing, and inappropriate their new living quarters were, nothing else seemed clear at all. We wanted to use the Library of Records to learn more about Jacques Snicket, Violet said, but we might end up learning more about ourselves. What in the world do you think is written about us in that file Hal mentioned? I don't know, Klaus replied, and I don't think Hal knows either. He said he doesn't read any of the files.
Sieg,
Sunny said, which meant, and I was afraid to ask him any more about it. Me too,
Violet said. "We simply can't call attention to ourselves. Any minute now, Hal could learn that we're wanted for murder, and we'd be dragged off to jail before we learned anything more." "We've already escaped from one jail cell," Klaus said. "I don't know if we could do it again." "I thought if we had a chance to look over these pages from Duncan's and Isadora's notebooks," Violet said, "we would find the answers to our questions, but the Quagmire's notes are very difficult to read." Klaus frowned and moved a few fragments of the Quagmire pages around, as if they were pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. "The harpoon gun tore these pages to shreds," he said. "Look what Duncan has written here. Jacques Snicket worked for VFD, which stands for Volunteer," and then it's ripped, right in the middle of the sentence. "And on this page," Violet said, picking up a page I cannot bear to think about, "it reads, 'In photographs and in each public place, Snicket rarely shows his face.' Isadora must have written that one. It's a rhyming couplet." "This scrap says apartment," Klaus said, "and has what looks like half of a map. That might have to do with the apartment where we lived with Jerome and Esme Squalor." "Ooh, don't remind me," Violet said, shuddering at the thought of all the misfortune the children had encountered at 667 Dark Avenue. "Rabave," Sunny said, pointing to one of the pieces of paper. "This page has two names on it," Violet said. "One name is Al Funcoot. That's the man who wrote that horrible play Olaf forced us to perform," Klaus said. "I know," Violet said, "but the other name I don't recognize. Anna Graham." "Well, the Quagmires were researching Count Olaf and his sinister plot," Klaus said. "Maybe Anna Graham is one of Olaf's associates." "It's probably not the hook-handed man," Violet said, "or the bald man with the long nose. Anna is not usually a man's name." "It could be the name of one of the white-faced women," Klaus said. "Orlando," Sunny said, which meant, or the one who looks like neither a man nor a woman. "Or someone we haven't even met yet," Violet said with a sigh, and turned her attention to another piece of paper. "This page isn't ripped at all, but all it has on it is a long list of dates. It looks like something was going on every 12 weeks or so." Klaus picked up the smallest piece and held it up for his sisters to see. Behind his glasses, his eyes looked very sad. "This piece just says, 'Fire,'" he said quietly, and the three Baudelaires looked down sadly at the dusty floor. With any word, there are subconscious associations, which simply means that certain words make you think of certain things, even if you don't want to. The word cake, for example, might remind you of your birthday, and the words prison warden might remind you of someone you haven't seen in a very long time. The word Beatrice reminds me of a volunteer organization that was swarming with corruption, and the word midnight reminds me that I must keep writing this chapter very quickly, or else I will probably drown. But the Baudelaires had all sorts of subconscious associations with the word fire, and none of them were pleasant to think about. The word made the children think of Hal, who had mentioned something about the Snicket fires that afternoon in the Library of Records. Fire made the youngsters think of Duncan and Isadora Quagmire, who had lost their parents and their brother Quigley in a fire. And of course the word fire made the Baudelaires think of the fire that had destroyed their home, and had begun the unfortunate journey that had led them to the half-finished wing of Heimlich Hospital. The three children huddled quietly together under their drop-cloths, getting colder and colder as they thought about all the fires and subconscious associations that were in the Baudelaire lives. "That file must contain the answers to all these mysteries," Violet said finally. "We need to find out who Jacques Snicket was, and why he had the same tattoo as Count Olaf. And we need to know why he was murdered," Klaus added. "And we need to learn the secret of VFD. Us," Sunny said, which meant, and we need to know why there's a picture of us in the file. "We have to get our hands on that file," Violet said. "That's easier said than done," Klaus pointed out.
Hal told us specifically not to touch any of the files we weren't working with, and he'll be right there with us in the Library of Records." "We'll just have to find a way," Violet replied. "Now, let's try and get a good night's sleep, so we can stay alert tomorrow and get a hold of the file on the Snicket fires." Klaus and Sunny nodded in agreement and arranged the drop cloths into a sort of bed, while Violet turned off the flashlights one by one. The three Baudelaires huddled together for the rest of the night, getting what sleep they could on a filthy floor with a cold wind blowing through their inappropriate home, and in the morning, after a breakfast of leftover fruit salad, they walked to the completed half of Heimlich Hospital and carefully walked down all those stairs, past the intercom speakers and the confusing maps. Hal was already in the Library of Records when they arrived, unlocking the file cabinets with his long loop of keys, and immediately Violet and Klaus got to work, filing the information that had come through the chute during the night, while Sunny turned her tooth's attention to the file cabinets that needed to be opened. But the Baudelaire's minds were not on filing or on file cabinets. Their minds were on the file. Just about everything in this world is easier said than done, with the exception of systematically assisting Sisyphus's stealthy, cyst-susceptible sister, which is easier done than said. But it is frustrating to be reminded of this fact. As Violet filed a piece of paper containing information on cuttlefish under M for mollusks, she said to herself, "I'll just walk down the S aisle and look under Snicket." But Hal was already in the S aisle, filing away paintings of sewing machines, and she could not do what she said. As Klaus filed a survey of thimbles under P for protection of the thumb, he said to himself, "I'll just walk down the F aisle and look under F for fires." But by that time Hal had moved to the F aisle and was opening a file cabinet to rearrange biographies of famous Finnish fishermen. And Sunny twisted her teeth this way and that, trying to open one of the locked file cabinets in the B aisle, thinking that perhaps the file was inside, filed under Baudelaire's. But when the lock finally broke, just after lunch, the youngest sibling opened the cabinet and saw that it was absolutely empty. "Nil," Sunny said, as the three children took a short fruit break in the antechamber. "Me neither," Klaus said. "But how can we get a hold of the file when Hal is always around?" "Maybe we can just ask him to find it for us," Violet said. "If this were a regular library, we would ask the librarian for help. In a library of records, maybe we should ask Hal." "You can ask me anything you want," Hal said, walking into the antechamber. "But first, I have to ask you something." He walked over to the children and pointed at one of the fruits. "Is that a plum or a persimmon?" he asked. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be, I'm afraid." "It's a plum," Violet said, handing it to him. "Oh, good," Hal replied, looking it over for bruises. "I was not in the mood for a persimmon. Now, what is your question?" "We had a question about a certain file," Klaus began carefully, not wanting Hal to become suspicious. "I know it's not customary for us to read the files, but if we were very curious, would it be okay to make an exception?" Hal bit into the plum and frowned. "Why would you want to read one of the files?" he asked. "Children should read happy books with bright pictures, not official information from the Library of Records." "But we're interested in official information," Violet said, "and we're so busy filing things away that we don't get a chance to read anything in the files. That's why we were hoping to take one home with us and read it." Hal shook his head. "Paperwork is the most important thing we do in this hospital," he said sternly. "That's why the files are only allowed out of the room if there's a very important reason. For example..." But the Baudelaires did not get to hear an example, because Hal was interrupted by a voice coming over the intercom.
"Attention," the voice said,
and the children turned to face a small square speaker.
"Attention, attention."
The three siblings looked at one another in shock and horror, and then at the wall where the speaker was hanging. The voice coming over the intercom was not Babs's. It was a faint voice, and it was a scratchy voice, but it was not the voice of the head of human resources at Heimlich Hospital. It was a voice that the Baudelaires heard wherever they went, no matter where they lived or who tried to protect them, and even though the children had heard this voice so many times before, they had never got used to its sneering tone, as if the person talking were telling a joke with a horrible and violent punchline.
"Attention,"
the voice said again, but the orphans did not have to be told to pay attention to the terrible voice of Count Olaf.
"Babs has resigned from the Heimlich Hospital,"
said the voice, and the siblings felt as if they could see the cruel smile Olaf always had on his face when he was telling lies.
"She decided to pursue a career as a stunt woman, and has begun throwing herself off buildings immediately. My name is Mattathias, and I am the new head of human resources. I will be conducting a complete inspection of every single employee here at Heimlich Hospital, beginning immediately. That is all." "An inspection,"
Hal repeated, finishing his plum.
"What nonsense. They should finish the other half of this hospital instead of wasting time inspecting everything."
"What happens during an inspection?" Violet asked.
"Oh, they just come and look you over,"
Hal said carelessly, and began walking back to the Library of Records.
"We'd better get back to work. There is a lot more information to file."
"We'll be along in a moment," Klaus promised. "I'm not quite done with my fruit."
"Well, hurry up,"
Hal said, and left the anteroom. The Baudelaires looked at one another in worry and dismay.
"He's found us again,"
Violet said, talking quietly so Hal could not hear them. She could barely hear her own voice over the sound of her heart, pounding with fear. "He must know we're here," Klaus agreed. "That's why he's doing the inspection, so he can find us and snatch us away."
"Tell,"
Sonny said. "Who can we tell?" Klaus asked. "Everyone thinks Count Olaf is dead. They won't believe three children if we say that he's disguised himself as Mattathias, the new head of human resources."
"Particularly three children who are on the front page of the Daily Punctilio," Violet added, "wanted for murder. Our only chance is to get that file on the Snicket fires and see if it has any evidence that will bring Olaf to justice."
"But files aren't allowed out of the Library of Records," Klaus said. "Then we'll have to read them right here," Violet said. "That's easier said than done," Klaus pointed out. "We don't even know what letter to look under, and Hal will be right in the room with us all day long."
"Night,"
Sonny said. "You're right, Sonny," Violet said. "Hal is here all day long, but he goes home at night. When it gets dark, we'll sneak back over here from the half-finished wing. It's the only way we'll be able to find the file." "You're forgetting something," Klaus said. "The Library of Records will be locked up tight. Hal locks all of the file cabinets, remember?" "I hadn't thought of that," Violet admitted. "I can invent one lockpick, but I'm not sure I'll have time to invent enough lockpicks to work on all those file cabinets."
"Yashu,"
Sonny said, which meant something like, "And it takes me several hours to open one cabinet with my teeth." "Without the keys, we'll never get the file," Klaus said. "And without the file, we'll never defeat Count Olaf. What can we do?" The children sighed and thought as hard as they could, staring in front of them as they did so, and as soon as they stared in front of them, they saw something that gave them an idea. The thing they saw was small and round, and had colourful and shiny skin, and the youngsters could see that it was a persimmon. But the Baudelaires knew that if someone's eyesight wasn't what it used to be, it might look like a plum. The Baudelaire orphans sat and stared at the persimmon, and began to think how they might fool someone into thinking one thing was really another. Chapter 6. This is not a tale of Lemony Snicket. It is useless to tell the Snicket story, because it happened so very long ago, and because there is nothing anybody can do about the way it has turned out. So the only reason I could possibly have for jotting it down in the margins of these pages would be to make this book even more unpleasant, unnerving, and unbelievable than it already is. This is a story about Violet, Klaus, and Sonny Baudelaire, and how they discovered something in the Library of Records of Heimlich Hospital that changed their lives forever, and still gives me the heebie-jeebies whenever I am alone at night. Stop. But if this were a book about me, instead of about the 3 children who would soon run into someone they had hoped never to see again, I might pause for a moment and tell you about something I did many years ago that still troubles me. It was a necessary thing to do, but it was not a nice thing, and even now I get a small quiver of shame in my stomach whenever I remember it. I might be doing something I enjoy, walking along the promenade deck of a ship, or looking through a telescope at the aurora borealis, or wandering into a bookstore and placing my books on the highest place in the shelf so that no one will be tempted to buy and read them, when I will suddenly remember this thing I did and think to myself, was it really necessary? Was it absolutely necessary to steal that sugar bowl from Esme's squalor? The Baudelaire orphans were experiencing similar quivers that afternoon as they finished up the day's work in the Library of Records. Every time Violet put a file in its proper place, she would feel her hair ribbon in her pocket and get a quiver in her stomach as she thought about what she and her siblings were up to. Klaus would take a stack of papers from the basket in front of the deposit chute, and instead of placing the paper clips in the small bowl, he would keep them hidden in his hand, feeling a quiver in his stomach as he thought about the trick he and his sisters were going to play. And whenever Hal turned his back, and Klaus passed the paper clips to Sonny, the youngest Baudelaire felt a quiver in her stomach as she thought about the sneaky way they were going to return to the Library of Records that night. By the time Hal was locking up the file cabinets for the day with his long loop of keys, the 3 Baudelaire children had enough quivers in their stomach to attend a quivery stomach festival, if there had been one in the area that afternoon. "Is it absolutely necessary to do this?" Violet murmured to Klaus, as the 3 children followed Hal out of the library into the anteroom. She took her hair ribbon out of her pocket and smoothed it out, making sure it didn't have any tangles. "It's not a nice thing to do." "I know," Klaus answered, holding his hand out so Sonny could hand back the paper clips. "I have a quiver in my stomach just thinking about it, but it's the only way we can get our hands on that file."
"Olaf,"
Sonny said grimly. She meant before Mattathias gets his hands on us, and as soon as she was finished with her sentence, Mattathias's scratchy voice came over the intercom.
"Attention! Attention!"
the voice said, as Hal and the Baudelaires looked up at the square speaker.
"This is Mattathias, the new head of human resources. Inspections are over for the day, but will continue tomorrow."
"What nonsense," Hal muttered, putting the loop of keys down on the table. The Baudelaires looked at one another and then at the keys as Mattathias continued his announcement.
"Also,"
the speaker said,
"if anyone in the hospital has any valuables of any kind, please bring them to the Human Resources Office for safekeeping. Thank you."
"My eyeglasses are somewhat valuable," Hal said, taking them off.
But I'm not going to bring them to the Human Resources Office. I might not ever see them again."
"That's probably true," Violet said, shaking her head at Mattathias's audacity, a word which here means attempt to steal valuables from hospital employees, in addition to snatching the Baudelaire fortune.
"Besides,"
Hal said, smiling at the children and reaching for his coat,
"nobody's going to steal anything from me. You three are the only people I see at the hospital, and I trust you absolutely. Now, where did I put my keys?"
"Here they are," Violet said, and the quiver in her stomach got worse. She held up her hair ribbon, which had been tied into a circle to look like a loop of string. Hanging from the ribbon was a long row of paper clips, which Sunny had fashioned into different shapes with her teeth when Hal wasn't looking. The result looked something like Hal's loop of keys, the way a horse looks something like a cow, or a woman in a green dress looks something like a pine tree, but there was no way anyone would look at Violet's hair ribbon full of chewed-up paper clips and think it was a ring of keys, unless, of course, their eyesight was not what it used to be. The three children waited as Hal squinted at what Violet was holding.
"Those are my keys,"
Hal said doubtfully.
"I thought I put them down on the table."
"Oh, no," Klaus said quickly, standing in front of the table so Hal wouldn't catch a glimpse of his real keys. "Violet has them." "Here," Violet said, moving them back and forth so they would be even harder to squint at. "Why don't I put them in your coat pocket for you?"
"Thank you,"
Hal said, as Violet dropped them into his overcoat pocket. He looked at the Baudelaires, his tiny eyes shining with gratitude.
"That's another way you three have helped me. My eyesight's not what it used to be, you know, so I'm glad I can rely on such good volunteers. Well, good night, children. I'll see you tomorrow."
"Good night, Hal," Klaus replied. "We're just going to have one last piece of fruit here in the anteroom."
"Don't spoil your dinner," Hal said. "It's supposed to be a very cold evening, so I bet your parents have cooked up a nice hot meal."
Hal smiled and shut the door behind him, leaving the children alone with the real keys to the Library of Records, and the quivery feeling still in their stomachs. "Someday," Violet said quietly, "we'll apologize to Hal for playing a trick on him and explain why we had to break the rules. This wasn't a nice thing to do, even though it was necessary." "And we'll return to the Last Chance General Store," Klaus said, "and explain to the shopkeeper why we had to run away."
"Twisp,"
Sunny said firmly, which meant, but not until we get a hold of the file, solve all these mysteries, and prove our innocence. "You're right, Sunny," Violet said with a sigh. "Let's get started. Klaus, see if you can find the right key for the library door." Klaus nodded and carried Hal's keys over to the door. Not too long ago, when the Baudelaires had been staying with Aunt Josephine by the shores of Lake Lachrymose, Klaus had been in a situation in which he had to match up a key to a locked door very, very quickly, and since then he had been quite good at it. He looked at the lock of the door, which had a very short and narrow keyhole, and then looked at the loop of string, which had one very short and narrow key. And in no time at all the children were re-entering the Library of Records and looking down the dim aisles of file cabinets. "I'm going to lock the door behind us," Klaus said, "so that nobody will get suspicious if they happen to walk into the anteroom." "Like Mattathias," said Violet with a shudder. "On the intercom, he said that they were stopping the inspections for the day, but I bet he's really still looking."
"Vapey,"
Sunny said, which meant, then let's hurry. "Let's start with the S aisle," Violet said, "for Snicket." "Right," Klaus said, locking the door with a rattle. The three children found the S aisle and began walking past the file cabinets, reading the labels on them to figure out which one to open. "Source to saxifrage," Klaus read out loud. "That means that anything that falls alphabetically between the word source and the word saxifrage will be in this cabinet. That would be fine if we wanted the sawmill file. Or the sauna file, Violet said. Let's move on. The children moved on, their footsteps echoing off the low ceilings of the room. Scarab to scavenger, Klaus said, reading one farther down the aisle. Sunny and Violet shook their heads, and the Baudelaires kept moving. Secretary to sediment, Violet read. We're still not there. Calm, Sunny said, which meant, I can't read very well, but I think this one says sequel to serenity. You're right, Sunny, Klaus said, smiling at his sister. It's the wrong one. Shed to sheepshank, Violet read. Shellac to sherbet, Klaus read, walking farther down the aisle. Shipwreck to shrimp, Sicily to sideways, skylight to slob, sludge to smoke, snack to snifter, snowball to sober, sonnet to spackle. Wait, Klaus cried. Back up. Snicket is between snack and snifter. You're right, Violet said, stepping back to find the right cabinet. I was so distracted by all the strange file names that I forgot what we were looking for. Here it is, snack to snifter. Let's hope the file we're looking for is here. Klaus looked at the lock on the file cabinet and found the right key on Hal's loop on only the third try. It should be in the bottom drawer, Klaus said, close to snifter. Let's look. The Baudelaires looked. A snifter is a type of glass, usually meant for holding brandy, although it is also the term for a strong wind. Plenty of words are close to snifter in the alphabet, and the children found many of them. There was a file on sniffing, which seemed to have many photographs of noses. There was a file on Snell's law, which states that a ray of light passing from one uniform medium to another produces an identical ratio between the sine of the angle of incidence and the sine of the angle of refraction, which Klaus already knew. There was a file on the inventor of the sneaker, whom Violet admired very much, and one on snicking, which is something Sunny had done many times with her teeth. But there was not a single scrap of paper marked Snicket. The children sighed in disappointment, and shut the drawer of the file cabinet so Klaus could lock it again. Let's try the J aisle for Jacques, Violet suggested. Shh, Sunny said. No, Sunny, Klaus said gently. I don't think the H aisle is a good bet. Why would Hal have filed it under H? Shh, Sunny insisted, pointing at the door, and her siblings knew instantly that they had misunderstood her. Usually when Sunny said, shh, she meant something along the lines of, I think the H aisle might be a good place to look for the file, but this time she meant something more along the lines of, be quiet, I think I hear someone walking into the anteroom of the Library of Records. Sure enough, when the Baudelaires listened closely, they could hear the clomping of some odd, teetering footsteps, as if someone were walking on very thin stilts. The footsteps grew closer and closer, and then stopped, and as the three children held their breath, the door to the library rattled as someone tried to open the door. Maybe it's Hal, Violet whispered, trying to unlock the door with a paper clip. Maybe it's Mattathias, Klaus whispered, looking for us. Janitor, Sunny whispered. Well, whoever it is, Violet said, we better hurry to the J aisle. The Baudelaires tiptoed across the low-ceilinged room to the J aisle and walked down it quickly, reading the labels of the file cabinets. Jabberwocky to Jackal, Jacket to Jack-o'-lanterns, Nurse. That's it, Klaus whispered. Jacques will be in Jackline to Jackutinga. We hope, Violet said, as the door rattled again. Klaus hurried to find the right key, and the children opened the top drawer to look for Jacques. As Violet knew, Jackline is a kind of rope used in sailing, and as Klaus knew, Jackutinga is a sort of gold-bearing iron ore found in Brazil. And once again there were plenty of files between these two, but although the children found information on jack-o'-lanterns, Jack Russell Terriers, and Jacobean drama, there was no file marked Jacques. Fire, Klaus whispered, shutting and locking the file cabinet.
Let's head to the F aisle. And hurry, Violet said. It sounds like the person in the anteroom is picking the lock.
It was true. The Baudelaires paused for a moment and heard a muffled scratching from behind the door, as if something long and thin were being stuck in the keyhole to try to unlock the lock. Violet knew, from when she and her siblings lived with Uncle Monty, that a lockpick can often take a long time to work properly, even if it has been made by one of the world's great inventors. But the children nonetheless moved to the F aisle as fast as their tiptoes could carry them.
Fabian to fact, fainting to fangs, fatalism to Faulkner, fear to Fermat, ficus to filth, fin de siècle to Fissel. Here it is.
Once more the Baudelaires hurried to find the proper key, and then the proper drawer, and then the proper file. Fin de siècle is a term for a time in history when a century is drawing to a close, and fissel is a fancy word for a rustling noise, like the one that continued to come from behind the locked door as the children looked frantically for fire. But the papers went right from Finland to firmament, without a single word on fire in between.
"What will we do?"
Violet asked, as the door began to rattle again.
"Where else could the fire be?"
"Let's try to think," Klaus said. "What did Hal say about the file? We know it has to do with Jacques Snicket and with fire."
"Prem,"
Sonny said, which meant, but we looked under Snicket, Jacques, and fire already.
"There must be something else," Violet said. "We have to find this file. It has crucial information about Jacques Snicket and VFD.
And about us," Klaus said. "Don't forget that." The three children looked at one another.
"Baudelaire,"
Sonny whispered. Without another word, the orphans ran to the B aisle and hurried past Babbitt to Babylon, Bacteria to Ballet, and Bamboo to Baskerville, stopping at Bat Mitzvah to Bavarian Cream. As the door continued to fissel behind them, Klaus tried 9 keys in a row before finally opening the cabinet, and there, between the Jewish coming-of-age ceremony for young women and the delicious filling of certain doughnuts, the children found a folder marked Baudelaire.
"It's here,"
Klaus said, taking it out of the drawer with trembling hands.
"What does it say? What does it say?"
Violet asked in excitement.
"Look," Klaus said. "There's a note on the front."
"Read it," Sonny said in a frantic whisper, as the door began to shake violently on its hinges. Whoever was on the other side of the door was obviously getting frustrated with trying to pick the lock. Klaus held up the file so he could see what the note said in the dim light of the room. "All 13 pages of the Snicket file have been removed from the Library of Records for the official investigation." He looked up at his sisters, and they could see behind his glasses his eyes were filling with tears.
"That must be when Hal saw our picture,"
he said,
"when he removed the file and gave it to the official investigators."
He dropped the file on the floor and then sat down beside it in despair.
"There's nothing here." "Yes, there is," Violet said. "Look."
The Baudelaires looked at the file where Klaus had dropped it on the ground. There, behind the note, was a single sheet of paper.
"It's page 13,
Violet said, looking at a number typed in a corner of the paper.
"The investigators must have left it behind by mistake."
"That's why you should keep paper clips on papers that belong together," Klaus said, "even when you file them. But what does the page say?" With a long crackle and a loud bang, the door to the Library of Records was knocked off its hinges and fell to the floor of the enormous room as if it had fainted. But the children paid no attention. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny all sat and looked at page 13 of the file, too amazed to even listen to the odd, teetering footsteps as the intruder entered the room and began to walk along the aisles of file cabinets. Page 13 of the Baudelaire file was not a crowded sheet of paper. There was just one photograph stapled into place below one sentence of type. But sometimes it takes only a photograph and a sentence to make an author cry himself to sleep, even years after the photograph was taken, or to make three siblings sit and stare at a page for a long time, as if an entire book were printed on one sheet of paper. There were 4 people in the photograph, standing together outside a building the Baudelaires recognized immediately. It was 667 Dark Avenue, where the orphans had lived with Jerome and Esme Squalor for a brief time, until it became another place too treacherous for the children to stay. The first person in the photograph was Jacques Snicket, who was looking at the photographer and smiling. Standing next to Jacques was a man who was turned away from the camera, so the children could not see his face, only one of his hands, which was clutching a notebook and pen, as if the obscured man were a writer of some sort. The children had not seen Jacques Snicket since he was murdered, of course, and the writer appeared to be someone they had never seen at all. But standing next to these 2 people were another 2 people the Baudelaire children thought they would never see again. Bundled up in long coats, looking cold but happy, were the Baudelaire parents. Because of the evidence discussed on page 9, read the sentence above the photograph, experts now suspect that there may in fact be one survivor of the fire, but the survivor's whereabouts are unknown. Chapter 7. "I never thought I'd live to see the day," Violet said, and took another look at page 13 of the file. The Baudelaire parents looked back at her, and for a moment it seemed to Violet her father would step out of the photograph and say, "There you are, Ed! Where have you been?" Ed was short for Thomas Alva Edison, one of the greatest inventors of all time, and it was a special nickname only used by her father. But the man in the photograph did not move, of course, but only stood smiling in front of 667 Dark Avenue. "Me neither," Klaus said. "I never thought we'd see our parents again." The middle Baudelaire looked at his mother's coat, which had a secret pocket on the inside. In the secret pocket she often kept a small pocket dictionary, which she would take out whenever she encountered a word she did not know. Because Klaus was so interested in reading, she had promised that someday she would give the pocket dictionary to him. And now it seemed to Klaus that his mother was about to reach into her coat and put the small leather-bound book in his hand.
"Neither me,"
Sunny said. She looked at her parents' smiles, and suddenly remembered for the first time since the fire a song that her mother and father used to sing together when it was time for Sunny to go to sleep. The song was called The Butcher Boy, and the Baudelaire parents would take turns singing the verses, her mother singing in her high, breathy voice, and her father in his, which was as low and deep as a foghorn. The Butcher Boy was the perfect way for Sunny to end the day, safe and cozy in the Baudelaire crib. "This photograph must have been taken a long time ago," Violet said. "Look how much younger they look. They aren't even wearing their wedding rings." "Because of the evidence discussed on page 9, Klaus said, reading the sentence typed above the photograph, experts now suspect that there may in fact be one survivor of the fire, but the survivor's whereabouts are unknown." He stopped and looked at his sisters. "What does that mean?" he said in a very faint voice. "Does that mean one of our parents is still alive?" "Well, well, well," said a familiar and sneering voice, and the children heard the odd, tottering footsteps walk straight toward them. "Look what we have here." The Baudelaire orphans had been so shocked by what they had found that they had forgotten about the person breaking into the Library of Records, and now they looked up to see a tall, skinny figure walking down the B aisle. Stop. It was a person they had seen recently, and one they had hoped never to see again. There are many different ways of describing this person, including Count Olaf's girlfriend, the Baudelaire children's former guardian, the city's 6th most important financial advisor, a former resident of 667 Dark Avenue, and several phrases that are far too nasty to be placed in a book. But the name she preferred was the one that came snarling out of her lipsticked mouth. "I am Esme Gigi Genevieve Squalor," said Esme, Gigi, Genevieve, Squalor, as if the Baudelaires would ever forget her, no matter how hard they tried. She stopped walking and stood in front of the Baudelaires, who saw immediately why her footsteps had been so odd and tottering. For as long as the children had known her, Esme Squalor had been a slave to fashion, a phrase which here means dressed in incredibly expensive and often incredibly absurd outfits. This evening she was wearing a long coat, made from the fur of a number of animals that had been killed in particularly unpleasant ways, and she was carrying a handbag shaped like an eye, just like the tattoo her boyfriend had on his left ankle. She wore a hat with a small veil that hung in front of her face, as if she had blown her nose with a black lacy handkerchief and then forgotten to remove it. And on her feet she had a pair of shoes with stiletto heels. A stiletto is a small, slender knife, resembling a dagger, such as might be carried by a carnival performer or a murderer, and the word stiletto has been used to describe a woman's shoe with a very long and narrow heel. In this case, however, the phrase shoes with stiletto heels actually refers to a pair of shoes made with a small, slender knife where each heel should be. The stilettos were pointing straight down, so that Esme viciously stabbed the floor of the Library of Records with each step, and occasionally the stiletto stuck, so the wicked woman had to pause and yank them out of the floor, which explained why her footsteps were so odd and tottering. These shoes happened to be the absolute latest fashion, but the Baudelaires had more important things to do than leaf through magazines describing what was in and what was out, so they could only stare at Esme's shoes and wonder why she was wearing footwear that was so violent and impractical. "This is a pleasant surprise," Esme said. "Olaf asked me to break in here and destroy the Baudelaire file, but now we can destroy the Baudelaires as well." The children looked at each other in shock. "You and Olaf know about the file?" Violet asked. Esme laughed in a particularly nasty way, and from behind her veil smiled a particularly nasty smile. "Of course we know about it," she snarled. "And that's why I'm here, to destroy all 13 pages." She took one odd, tottering step toward the Baudelaires. "That's why we destroyed Jacques Snicket." She took another stabbing step down the aisle. "And that's why we're gonna destroy you." She looked down at her shoe and shook her foot wildly to get the blade out of the library floor. "Heimlich Hospital is about to have 3 new patients," she said, "but I'm afraid it'll be too late for any doctor to save their lives." Klaus stood up and followed his sisters as they began to step away from the slave to fashion, who was moving slowly toward them. "Who survived the fire?" he asked Esme, holding up the page from the file. "Is one of our parents alive?" Esme frowned and teetered on her stiletto heels as she tried to snatch the page away. "Did you read the file?" she demanded in a terrible voice. "What does the file say?" "You'll never find out," Violet cried, and turned to her siblings. "Run!" The Baudelaires ran, straight down the aisle past the rest of the B files, rounding the corner past the cabinet that read Byron to Byzantine, and around to the section of the library where all of the C files were stored. "We're running the wrong way," Klaus said. "Egress," Sunny agreed, which meant something along the lines of, "Klaus is right, the exit is the other way." "So is Esme," Violet replied. "Somehow we'll have to go around her." "I'm coming for you," Esme cried, her voice coming over the top of the file cabinets. "You'll never escape, orphans." The Baudelaires paused at the cabinet reading Conch to Condy's fluid, which are a fancy seashell and a complex chemical compound, and listened as Esme's heels clattered in pursuit. "We're lucky she's wearing those ridiculous shoes," Klaus said. "We can run much faster than she can." "As long as she doesn't think of taking them off," Violet said. "She's almost as clever as she is greedy." "Shh," Sunny said. And the Baudelaires listened as Esme's footsteps abruptly stopped. The children huddled together as they heard Olaf's girlfriend mutter to herself for a moment. And then the three youngsters began to hear a terrifying sequence of sounds. There was a long screechy creak, and then a booming crash, and then another long screechy creak, and another booming crash, and the pair of sounds continued, getting louder and louder. The youngsters looked at one another in puzzlement, and then, just in the nick of time, the oldest Baudelaire figured out what the sound was. "She's knocking over the file cabinets," Violet cried, pointing over the top of confetti to consecration. "They're toppling over like dominoes." Klaus and Sonny looked where their sister was pointing, and saw that she was right. Esme had pushed over one file cabinet, which had pushed over another, which had pushed over another, and now the heavy metal cabinets were crashing toward the children like a wave crashing on the shore. Violet grabbed her siblings and pulled them out of the path of a falling file cabinet. With a creak and a crash, the cabinet fell to the floor, right where they had been standing. The three children breathed a sigh of relief, having just narrowly avoided being crushed beneath files on congruent triangles, coniferous trees, conjugated verbs, and 200 other topics.
"I'm gonna flatten you,"
Esme called, starting on another line of cabinets.
"Olaf and I are going to have a romantic breakfast of Baudelaire pancakes."
"Run!" Sonny cried, but her siblings needed no urging. The three children hurried down the rest of the C aisle as the cabinets creaked and crashed all around them. "Where can we go?" Violet cried. "To the D aisle," Klaus answered, but changed his mind as he saw another row of cabinets begin to topple. "No, the E aisle." "B?" Violet asked, finding it difficult to hear over the sounds of the cabinets. "E!" Klaus cried. "E, as in exit." The Baudelaires ran down E, as in exit, but when they reached the last cabinet, the row was becoming F, as in falling file cabinets, G, as in go the other way, and H, as in how in the world are we going to escape? Before long, the children found themselves as far from the anteroom door as they possibly could be. As the cabinets crashed around them, and Esme cackled wildly and stabbed the floor in pursuit, the three youngsters found themselves in the area of the Library of Records where information was deposited. As the room creaked and crashed around them, the siblings looked first at the basket of papers, then at the bowl of paper clips, then the mouth of the chute, and finally at one another. "Violet," Klaus said hesitantly, "do you think you can invent something out of paper clips and a basket that could help us get out of here?" "I don't have to," Violet said. "That chute will serve as an exit." "But you won't fit in there," Klaus said. "I'm not even sure I will."
"You're never gonna get out of this room alive, you imbeciles!"
Esme cried, using a horrible word in her horrible voice. "We'll have to try," Violet said. "Sonny, go first." "Prapil," Sonny said doubtfully, but she went first, crawling easily into the chute and staring out through the darkness at her siblings. "Now you, Klaus," Violet said, and Klaus, removing his glasses so they wouldn't break, followed his sister. It was a tight fit, and it took some manoeuvring, but eventually the middle Baudelaire worked his way through the mouth of the chute. "This won't work," Klaus said to Violet, peering around him. "It'll be tough to crawl up through the chute the way it's slanted. Besides, there's no way you'll fit." "Then I'll find another way," Violet said. Her voice was calm, but Klaus and Sonny could see through the hole in the wall that her eyes were wide with fear. "That's out of the question," Klaus said. "We'll climb back out and the three of us will escape together." "We can't risk it," Violet said. "Esme won't catch all of us, not if we split up. You take page 13 and go up the chute, and I'll get out another way. We'll meet up in the unfinished wing." "No!" Sonny cried. "Sonny's right," Klaus said. "This is what happened with the Quagmires, remember? When we left them behind, they were snatched away." "The Quagmires are safe now," Violet reminded him. "Don't worry, I'll invent a solution." The eldest Baudelaire gave her siblings a small smile and reached into her pocket so she could tie up her hair and put the levers and gears of her inventing mind into motion. But there was no ribbon in her pocket. As her trembling fingers explored her empty pocket, she remembered she had used her ribbon to fool Hal with a fake loop of keys. Violet felt a quiver in her stomach as she remembered, but she had no time to feel bad about the trick she had played. With sudden horror, she heard a creak right behind her, and she jumped out of the way just in time to avoid the crash. A file cabinet labelled Linguistics to Lions fell against the wall, blocking the mouth of the chute. "Violet!" Sunny cried. She and her brother tried to push the cabinet aside, but the strength of a 13-year-old boy and his baby sister were no match against a metal case holding files on everything from the history of language to a large carnivorous feline found in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of India. "I'm okay," Violet called back. "Not for long, you're not," Esme snarled from a few aisles over. Klaus and Sunny sat in the dark chute and heard their sister's faint voice as she called to them. "Leave me here," she insisted. "I'll meet you back in our filthy, cold, inappropriate home." The two younger Baudelaires huddled together at the entrance of the chute, but it is useless for me to describe to you how desperate and terrified they felt. There is no reason to describe how horrible it was to hear Violet's frantic footsteps across the library of records, or the odd tottering ones of Esme, as she pursued the eldest Baudelaire in her stiletto heels, creaking and crashing file cabinets with every stabbing step. It is unnecessary to describe the cramped and difficult journey Klaus and Sunny made up the chute, which was slanted so steeply that it felt to the two orphans like they were crawling up a large mountain covered in ice, instead of a fairly short chute used for depositing information. It is ineffectual to describe how the two children felt when they finally reached the end of the chute, which was another hole carved into the outside wall of Heimlich Hospital, and found that Hal was right when he said it was to be a particularly cold evening. And it is absolutely futile, a word which here means useless, unnecessary, and ineffectual, because there is no reason for it, to describe how they felt as they sat in the half-finished section of the hospital, with drop-cloths wrapped around them to keep them warm and flashlights lit around them to keep them company, and waited for Violet to show up, because Klaus and Sunny Baudelaire were not thinking of these things. The two younger Baudelaires sat together, clutching page 13 of the Baudelaire file, as the night grew later and later. But they were not thinking about the noises they heard coming from the library of records, or about the journey up the chute, or even about the icy breeze as it blew through the plastic sheets and chilled the Baudelaire bones. Klaus and Sunny were thinking about what Violet had said when she saw the piece of paper they were clutching now. "I never thought I'd live to see the day," Violet had said. And her two siblings knew that the phrase was just another way of saying, "I'm very surprised," or "I'm extremely flabbergasted," or "This blows my mind beyond belief." But now, as the two Baudelaires waited more and more anxiously for their sister, Klaus and Sunny began to fear that the phrase Violet used was more appropriate than she ever would have guessed. As the first pale rays of the morning sun began to shine on the unfinished half of the hospital, the Baudelaires grew more and more frightened that their sister would not live to see the day. Chapter 8. Heimlich Hospital is gone now, and will probably never be rebuilt. If you want to visit it, you have to convince a farmer to let you borrow his mule, for nobody in the surrounding area is willing to go within 12 miles of its wreckage, and once you arrive, you can hardly blame them. The few scraps of the building that have survived are covered with a thick and prickly type of ivy called kudzu, which makes it difficult to see what the hospital looked like when the Baudelaires first arrived in the VFD van. The confusing maps have been gnawed off the walls of the sagging staircases, so it is very hard to imagine how troublesome it was to find one's way through all of the areas of the building. and the intercom system has long since crumbled away, with only a handful of square speakers left sitting among the ashen rubble. So it is impossible to imagine just how unnerving it was when Klaus and Sonny heard the latest announcement from Mattathias.
"Attention,"
Mattathias announced. There were no intercom speakers installed in the unfinished half of the hospital, so the two younger Baudelaires had to listen very hard to hear the scratchy voice of their enemy coming from one of the outdoor speakers.
"Attention, attention. This is Mattathias, the head of human resources. I am cancelling the remainder of the hospital inspections. We have found what we were looking for."
There was a pause as Mattathias moved away from the microphone, and as Klaus and Sonny listened very hard, they could hear the faint noise of triumphant, high-pitched laughter coming from the head of human resources.
"Excuse me,"
he continued when his giggling fit was over.
"To continue, please be aware that two of the three Baudelaire murderers, Klaus and Clyde and Susie Baudelaire, have been spotted in the hospital. If you see any children whom you recognize from the Daily Punctilio, please capture them and notify the police."
Mattathias stopped talking and began to giggle again, until the children heard the voice of Esme Squalor whispering,
"Darling, you forgot to turn off the intercom."
Then there was a click, and everything was silent. "They caught her," Klaus said. Now that the sun had risen, it wasn't very cold in the half-finished section of the hospital, but the middle Baudelaire shivered nonetheless. That's what Mattathias meant when he said that they had found what they were looking for.
"Danger,"
Sonny said grimly. "She certainly is," Klaus said. "We have to rescue Violet before it's too late."
"Vroom,"
Sonny said, which meant, "But we don't know where she is." "She must be somewhere in the hospital," Klaus said. "Otherwise Mattathias wouldn't still be here. He and Esme are probably hoping to capture us, too."
"Ramps,"
Sonny said. "And the file," Klaus agreed, taking page 13 out of his pocket, where he had been storing it for safekeeping, along with the scraps of the Quagmire notebooks. "Come on, Sonny. We've got to find our sister and get her out of there."
"Linda Stowe,"
Sonny said. She meant, "That'll be tough. We'll have to wander around the hospital looking for her, while other people will be wandering around the hospital looking for us." "I know," Klaus said glumly. "If anyone recognizes us from the Daily Punctilio, we'll be in jail before we can help Violet."
"Disguise,"
Sonny said. "I don't know how," Klaus said, looking around the half-finished room. "All we have here is some flashlights and a few drop cloths. I suppose if we wrapped the drop cloths around us and put the flashlights on top of our heads, we could try to disguise ourselves as piles of construction materials."
"Gedoost,"
Sonny said, which meant, "But piles of construction materials don't wander around hospitals." "Then we'll have to walk into the hospital without disguises," Klaus said. "We'll just have to be extra careful." Sonny nodded emphatically, a word which here means as if she thought being extra careful was a very good plan, and Klaus nodded emphatically back. But as they left the half-finished wing of the hospital, the two children felt less and less emphatic about what they were doing. Ever since that terrible day at the beach, when Mr. Poe brought them news of the fire, all three Baudelaires had been extra careful all of the time. They had been extra careful when they lived with Count Olaf, and Sonny had still ended up dangling from a cage outside Olaf's tower room. They had been extra careful when they'd worked at the Lucky Smells lumber mill, and Klaus had still ended up hypnotized by Dr. Orwell. And now the Baudelaires had been as careful as they could possibly be, but the hospital had turned out to be as hostile an environment as anywhere the three children had ever lived. But just as Klaus and Sonny entered the finished half of Heimlich Hospital, their feet moving less and less emphatically, and their hearts beating faster and faster, they heard something that soothed their savage breasts.
"We are volunteers fighting disease, and we're cheerful all day long. If someone said that we were sad, that person would be wrong."
There, coming around the corner, were the volunteers fighting disease, walking down the hall singing their cheerful song and carrying enormous bunches of heart-shaped balloons. Klaus and Sunny looked at one another and ran to catch up with the group. What better place to hide than among people who believed that no news was good news and so didn't read the newspaper?
"We visit people who are sick and try to make them smile, even if their noses bleed or if they cough up bile."
To the children's relief, the volunteers paid no attention as Klaus and Sunny infiltrated the group, a phrase which here means sneaked into the middle of a singing crowd. An especially cheerful singer seemed to be the only one who noticed, and she immediately handed a balloon to each newcomer. Klaus and Sunny held the balloons in front of their faces so that anybody passing by would see two volunteers with shiny helium-filled hearts instead of two accused criminals hiding in VFD.
"Tra-la-la, fiddle-dee-dee, hope you get well soon. Ho, 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 hee, have a heart-shaped balloon."
As the volunteers reached the chorus of the song, they marched into a hospital room in order to start giving a cheerful attitude to the patients. Inside the room, each lying uncomfortably in a metal bed, were a man with both legs in casts and a woman with both arms in bandages. Still singing, a man from VFD handed one balloon to the man and tied another to the woman's cast, because she could not hold it with her broken arms.
"Excuse me," said the man hoarsely. "Could you please call a nurse for me? I was supposed to take some painkillers this morning, but nobody has come to give them to me."
"And I'd like a glass of water,"
the woman said in a weak voice,
"if it's not too much trouble."
"Sorry," the bearded man replied, pausing for a moment to tune his guitar. "We don't have time to do things like that. We have to visit each and every room of the hospital, so we need to move quickly." "Besides," another volunteer said, giving the two patients a huge grin, "a cheerful attitude is a more effective way of fighting illness than painkillers or a glass of water, so cheer up and enjoy your balloon." The volunteer consulted a list he was holding. "Next on the patient list is a man named Bernard Rieu, in room 105 of the plague ward. Come on, brothers and sisters." The members of VFD cheered and continued the song as they left the room. Klaus and Sunny peered around the balloons they were holding and looked at one another in hope.
"If we visit each and every room in the hospital," Klaus whispered to his sister, "we're sure to find Violet."
"Mashalm,"
Sunny said, which meant, "I agree, although it won't be pleasant to see all these sick people."
"We visit people who are ill and try to make them laugh, even when the doctor says he must saw them in half."
Bernard Rieu turned out to be a man with a nasty hacking cough that shook his body so much he could scarcely hold his balloon, and it seemed to the two Baudelaire children that a good humidifier would have been a more effective way to fight this disease than a cheerful attitude. As the members of VFD drowned out his cough with another verse of the song, Klaus and Sunny were tempted to run and find a humidifier and bring it back to Bernard Rieu's room, but they knew that Violet was in much more danger than someone with a cough, so they stayed hidden in the group.
"We sing and sing all night and day, and then we sing some more. We sing to boys with broken bones and girls whose throats are sore."
The next patient on the list was Cynthia Vane, a young woman with a terrible toothache, who probably would have preferred something cold and easy to eat instead of a heart-shaped balloon, but as sore as her mouth looked, the children dared not run and find her applesauce or an ice cream snack. They knew she might have read the Daily Punctilio in order to pass the hours in the hospital room, and might recognize them if they showed their faces.
Tra-la-la, fiddle-dee-dee, hope you get well soon. Ho, 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 hee, have a heart-shaped balloon.
On and on the volunteers marched, and Klaus and Sonny marched with them, but with every ho, 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 and he, their hearts sank lower and lower. The two Baudelaires followed the members of VFG up and down the staircases of the hospital, and although they saw a great number of confusing maps, intercom speakers, and sick people, they did not catch a glimpse of their sister. They visited room 201 and sang to Jonah Mapple, who was suffering from seasickness, and they gave a heart-shaped balloon to Charlie Anderson in room 714, who had injured himself in an accident, and they visited Clarissa Dalloway, who did not seem to have anything wrong with her, but was staring sadly out the window of room 1308. But nowhere in any of the rooms that the volunteers marched into was Violet Baudelaire, who Klaus and Sonny feared was suffering more than any of the other patients.
Keun,
Sonny said, as the volunteers walked up yet another staircase. She meant something along the lines of, "We've been wandering around the hospital all morning, and we're no closer to rescuing our sister." And Klaus nodded grimly in agreement. "I know," Klaus said, "but the members of VFG are going to visit every single person in Heimlich Hospital. We're sure to find Violet eventually."
"Attention! Attention!"
a voice announced, and the volunteers stopped singing and gathered around the nearest intercom speaker to hear what Mattathias had to say.
"Attention,"
Mattathias said.
"Today is a very important day in the history of the hospital. In precisely 1 hour, a doctor here will perform the world's first cranioectomy on a 14-year-old girl. We all hope that this very dangerous operation is a complete success. That is all."
"Violet," Sonny murmured to her brother. "I think so too," Klaus said, "and I don't like the sound of that operation. Cranio means head, and ectomy is a medical term for removing something."
"Teacup?"
Sonny asked in a horrified whisper. She meant something like, "Do you think they're going to cut off Violet's head?" "I don't know," Klaus said with a shudder. "But we can't wander around with these singing volunteers any longer. We've got to find her right away."
"Okay,"
a volunteer called, consulting the list.
"The next patient is Emma Bovary in room 2611.
She has food poisoning, so she needs a particularly cheerful attitude."
"Excuse me, brother," Klaus said to the volunteer, reluctantly using the term brother instead of person I hardly know. "I was wondering if I could borrow your copy of the patient list."
"Of course," the volunteer replied. "I don't like to read all these names of sick people anyway. It's too depressing. I'd rather hold balloons."
With a cheerful smile, the volunteer handed Klaus the long list of patients and took the heart-shaped balloon out of his hands as the bearded man began the next verse of the song.
"We sing to men with measles and to women with flu, and if you breathe in deadly germs, we'll probably sing to you."
With his face exposed, Klaus had to duck down behind Sonny's balloon to look at the list of the hospital's patients. "There are hundreds of people on this list," he said to his sister, "and it's organized by ward, not by name. We can't read it all here in the hallway, particularly when we both have to hide behind one balloon."
"Damajat,"
Sonny said, pointing down the hall. By Damajat, she meant something along the lines of, "Let's hide in that supply closet over there." And sure enough, there was a door marked Supply Closet at the end of the hallway, past two doctors who had paused to chat beside one of the confusing maps. While the members of VFG started in on the chorus of their song as they walked toward Emma Bovary's room, Klaus and Sonny separated themselves from the volunteers and walked carefully toward the closet, holding the balloon in front of both their faces as best they could. Luckily, the two doctors were too busy talking about a sporting event they had watched on television to notice 2 accused murderers sneaking down the hallway of their hospital, and by the time the volunteers were singing, "Tra-la-la, fiddle-dee-dee, hope you get well soon. Ho, 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 hee, have a heart-shaped balloon," Klaus and Sonny were inside the closet. Like a church bell, a coffin, and a vat of melted chocolate, a supply closet is rarely a comfortable place to hide, and this supply closet was no...
Can you tell us what VFD stands for?
We certainly can. We are
volunteers fighting disease, and we're cheerful all day long. If someone said that we were sad, that person would be wrong. Tra-la-la, fiddly-dee, hope you get well soon. Ho, 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 hee, have a heart-shaped balloon.
Gosh, I love that.
We get to help people by singing.
We visit people who are very ill and try to make them laugh, even when the doctor says we must saw them in half. Tra-la-la, fiddly-dee, hope you get well soon. Oh, 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 hee, have a heart-shaped balloon. We visit people who are sick and try
I've never liked hospitals.
Well, technically, it's half the hospital.
No frowny faces, okay? Being cheerful is the whole point of volunteers fighting disease.
What exactly will we be doing here?
Well, mostly we just wander the halls, singing songs, and handing out heart-shaped balloons to each and every person on our list. Just like the song says.
How exactly does that help fight diseases?
Hey, everyone! Our new sister wants to know how singing songs fights diseases. Well, because
when you're laughing, you're... Okay, when you're laughing, you're taking in oxygen, or whatever, and that oxygen goes,
Because a cheerful attitude is the most effective tool against sickness.
I thought antibiotics were.
Come on, everybody!
No exception. When they shut the door of the closet behind them, the 2 younger Baudelaires found themselves in a small, cramped room, lit only by one flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. On one wall was a row of white medical coats hanging from hooks, and on the opposite wall was a rusty sink where one could wash one's hands before examining a patient. The rest of the closet was full of huge cans of alphabet soup for patients' lunches, and small boxes of rubber bands, which the children could not imagine came in very handy in a hospital. "Well," Klaus said, "it's not comfortable, but at least nobody will find us in here." "Pish," Sonny said, which meant something like, "At least until somebody needs rubber bands, alphabet soup, white medical coats, or clean hands." "Well, let's keep one eye on the door to see if anyone comes in," Klaus said. "But let's keep the other eye on this list. It's very long, but now that we have a few moments to look it over, we should be able to spot Violet's name." "Right," Sonny said. Klaus placed the list on top of a can of soup, and hurriedly began to flip through its pages. As he had noticed, the list of patients was not organized alphabetically, but by ward, a word which here means particular section of the hospital. So the 2 children had to look through every single page, hoping to spot the name Violet Baudelaire among the typed names of sick people. But as they glanced at the list under the heading Sore Throat Ward, perused the names on the Broken Neck Ward page, and combed through the names of all of the people who were staying in the ward for people with nasty rashes, Klaus and Sonny felt as if they were in a ward for people with sinking stomachs, because Violet's name was nowhere to be found. As the light bulb flickered above them, the 2 Baudelaires looked frantically at page after page of the list, but they found nothing that would help them locate their sister. "She's not here," Klaus said, putting down the last page of Pneumonia Ward. "Violet's name is nowhere on the list. How are we going to find her in this huge hospital if we can't figure out what ward she's in?" "Alias," Sunny said, which meant maybe she's listed under a different name. That's true, Klaus said, looking at the list again. After all, Mattathias's real name is Count Olaf. Maybe he made up a new name for Violet, so we couldn't rescue her. But which person is really Violet? She could be anyone from Mikhail Bulgakov to Haruki Murakami. What are we going to do? Somewhere in this hospital, they're getting ready to perform a completely unnecessary operation on our sister, and we... Klaus was interrupted by the sound of crackly laughter coming from over the Baudelaire's heads. The two children looked up and saw that a square intercom speaker had been installed on the ceiling.
"Attention,"
said Mattathias when he was done laughing.
"Dr. Flacutono, please report to the surgical ward. Dr. Flacutono, please report to the surgical ward to prepare for the cranioectomy." "Flacutono,"
Sunny repeated. "I recognize that name too," Klaus said. "That's the false name used by Count Olaf's associate when we lived in Poultryville."
"Teofrek,"
Sunny said frantically. She meant Violet's in grave danger. We have to find her immediately. But Klaus did not answer. Behind his glasses, his eyes were half closed, as they often were when he was trying to remember something he had read. "Flacutono," he muttered quietly. "Flacutono." Then he reached into his pocket, where he was keeping all the important papers the Baudelaires had gathered. "Al Funcoot," he said, and took out one of the pages of the Quagmire notebooks. It was the page that had written on it the words Anna Graham, a phrase that had not made any sense to the Baudelaires when they had looked at the pages together. Klaus looked at the Quagmire page, and then at the list of patients, and then at the page again. Then he looked at Sunny, and she could see his eyes grow wide behind his glasses, the way they always did when he had read something very difficult and understood it at last. "I think I know how to find Violet," Klaus said slowly. "But we'll need your teeth, Sunny."
"Ready,"
Sunny said, opening her mouth. Klaus smiled and pointed to the stacks of cans in the supply closet. "Open one of those cans of alphabet soup," he said, "and hurry." Chapter 9.
"Ricazier?"
Sunny asked, dumbfoundedly. The word dumbfoundedly here means wondering why in the world Klaus wanted to eat alphabet soup at a time like this. And ricazier here means, Klaus, why in the world do you want to eat alphabet soup at a time like this? "We're not going to eat it," Klaus said, handing Sunny one of the cans. "We're going to pour just about all of it down the sink."
"Pietri Sycamolo via del Recchio to Mexiti,"
Sunny said, which you will probably recall means something along the lines of, "I must admit I don't have the faintest idea of what is going on." Sunny had now said this particular thing 3 times over the course of her life, and she was beginning to wonder if this was something she was only going to say more and more as she grew older. "The last time you said that," Klaus said with a smile, "the 3 of us were trying to figure out the pages the Quagmires left behind." He held out a page for Sunny to see, and then pointed to the words Anna Graham. "We thought this was someone's name," Klaus said, "but it's really a kind of code. An anagram is when you move the letters around in one or more words to make another word or words."
"Still, Pietri Sycamolo via del Recchio to Mexiti,"
Sunny said with a sigh. "I'll give you an example," Klaus said. "It's the example the Quagmires found. Look, on the same page they wrote Al Funcoot. That's the name of the man who wrote The Marvelous Marriage, that dreadful play Count Olaf forced us to participate in."
"Yuck,"
Sunny said, which meant, "Don't remind me." "But look," Klaus said. "Al Funcoot has all the same letters as Count Olaf. Olaf just rearranged the letters in his name to hide the fact that he really wrote the play himself, you see?"
"Fromain,"
Sunny said, which meant something like, "I think I understand, but it's difficult for someone as young as myself." "It's difficult for me too," Klaus said. "That's why the alphabet soup will come in handy. Count Olaf uses anagrams when he wants to hide something, and right now he's hiding our sister. I bet she's somewhere on this list, but her name's been scrambled up. The soup is going to help unscramble her."
But how?
Sunny asked. "It's difficult to figure out anagrams if you can't move the letters around," Klaus said. "Normally, alphabet blocks or lettered tiles would be perfect, but alphabet noodles will do in a pinch. Now, hurry and open a can of soup." Sunny grinned, showing all of her sharp, sharp teeth, and then swung her head down onto the can of soup, remembering the day she had learned to open cans all by herself. It was not that long ago, although it felt like it was in the very distant past, because it was before the Baudelaire mansion burned down, when the entire family was happy and together. It was the Baudelaire's mother's birthday, and she was sleeping late while everyone baked a cake for her. Violet was beating the eggs, butter, and sugar with a mixing device she had invented herself. Klaus was sifting the flour with the cinnamon, pausing every few minutes to wipe his glasses. And the Baudelaire's father was making his famous cream cheese frosting, which would be spread thickly on top of the cake. All was going well until the electric can opener broke, and Violet didn't have the proper tools to fix it. The Baudelaire's father desperately needed to open a can of condensed milk to make his frosting, and for a moment it looked like the cake was going to be ruined. But Sunny, who had been playing quietly on the floor this whole time, said her first word, "Bite," and bit down on the can, poking 4 small holes so the sweet, thick milk could pour out. The Baudelaires laughed and applauded, and the children's mother came downstairs, and from then on they used Sunny whenever they needed to open a can of anything, except for beets. Now, as the youngest Baudelaire bit along the edge of the can of alphabet soup, she wondered if one of her parents had really survived the fire, and if she dared get her hopes up just because of one sentence on page 13 of the Snicket file. Sunny wondered if the Baudelaire family would ever be together again, laughing and clapping and working together to make something sweet and delicious.
"All done,"
Sunny said finally. "Good work, Sunny," Klaus said. "Now, let's try to find alphabet noodles that spell Violet's name."
"V?"
Sunny asked. "That's right," Klaus said. VIOLETBAUDELAIRE. The 2 younger Baudelaires reached into the can of soup and sorted through the diced carrots, chopped celery, blanched potatoes, roasted peppers, and steamed peas, which were all in a rich and creamy broth, made from a secret blend of herbs and spices, to find the noodles they needed. The soup was cold from sitting in the closet for months and months, and occasionally they would find the right letter only to have it fall into pieces or slip from their clammy fingers back into the can. But before too long, they had found a V, an I, an O, an L, an E, a T, a B, an A, a U, a D, another E, another L, another A, another I, an R, and a bit of carrot they decided to use when a third E was not to be found. "Now," Klaus said, after they laid all of the noodles on top of another can so they could move them around, "let's take another look at the list of patients. Mattathias announced that the operation would take place in the surgical ward, so let's look in that section of the list and try to see if any names look like good bets." Sunny poured the rest of the soup into the sink and nodded in agreement, and Klaus hurriedly found the surgical ward section of the list and read the names of the patients. Lisa N. Lutenday, Albert E. Develoia, Linda Raldine, Ada O. Ubervillet, Ed Valiant Brew, Laura V. Bleedioti, Monty Kensicle, Ned H. Roger, Eric Bluthitz, Ruth Deer Crump, Al Brisno, Carrie E. Abelabutaiti. "Goodness," Klaus said, "every single patient on the list has a name that looks like an anagram. How in the world can we sort through all these names before it's too late?"
"V,"
Sunny said. "You're right," Klaus said. Any name that doesn't have a V in it can't be an anagram of Violet Baudelaire. We could cross those off the list. If we had a pen, that is. Sunny reached thoughtfully into one of the white medical coats, wondering what doctors might keep in their pockets. She found a surgical mask, which is perfect for covering one's face, and a pair of rubber gloves that are perfect for protecting one's hands, and at the very bottom of the pocket she found a ballpoint pen, which is perfect for crossing out names which aren't the anagrams you're looking for. With a grin, Sunny handed the pen to Klaus, who quickly crossed out the names without V's. Now the list looked like this: Albert E. Develoia, Ada O. Ubervillet, Ed Valiant Brew, Laura V. Bleedioti. That makes it much easier, Klaus said. Now, let's move around the letters in Violet's name and see if we can spell out Albert E. Develoia. Working carefully to avoid breaking them, Klaus began to move the noodles he and Sunny had taken out of the soup, and soon learned that Albert E. Develoia and Violet Baudelaire were not quite anagrams. They were close, but they did not have the exact same letters in their names. Albert E. Develoia must be an actual sick person, Klaus said in disappointment. Let's try to spell out Ada O. Ubervillet. Once again, the supply closet was filled with the sound of shifting noodles, a faint and damp sound that made the children think of something slimy emerging from a swamp. It was, however, a far nicer sound than the one that interrupted their anagram decoding.
Attention! Attention!
Mattathias's voice sounded particularly snide as it called for attention from the square speaker over the Baudelaire's heads.
The surgical ward will now be closed for the cranioectomy. Only Dr. Flacutono and his associates will be allowed into the ward until the patient is dead. I mean, until the operation is over. That is all.
Velocity,
Sunny shrieked. I know we have to hurry, Klaus cried. I'm moving these noodles as quickly as I can. Ada O. Ubervillet isn't right either. He turned to the list of patients again to see who was next, and accidentally hit a noodle with his elbow, knocking it to the floor with a moist splat. Sunny picked it up for him, but the fall had split it into two pieces. Instead of an O, the Baudelaires now had a pair of parentheses. That's okay, Klaus said hurriedly. The next name on the list is Ed Valiant Brew, which doesn't have an O in it anyway.
Oh,
Sunny shrieked. Oh, Klaus agreed.
oh,
Sunny insisted. Oh, Klaus cried. I see what you mean. If it doesn't have an O in it, it can't be an anagram of Violet Baudelaire. That only leaves one name on the list, Laura V. Bleedioti. That must be the one we're looking for.
check.
Sunny said, and held her breath as Klaus moved the noodles around. In a few seconds, the name of the eldest Baudelaire sister had been transformed into Laura V. Bleedioti, except for the O, which Sunny still held in pieces in her tiny fist, and the last E, which was still a piece of carrot. It's her, all right, Klaus said with a grin of triumph. We've found Violet.
Ask clue,
Sunny said, which meant we never would have found her if you hadn't figured out that Olaf was using anagrams. It was really the Quagmire triplets who figured it out, Klaus said, holding up the notebook page, and it was you who opened the cans of soup, which made it much easier. But before we congratulate ourselves, let's rescue our sister. Klaus took a look at the list of patients. We'll find Laura V. Bleedioti in room 922 of the surgical ward.
Guito,
Sunny pointed out, which meant, but Mattathias closed the surgical ward. Then we'll have to open it, Klaus said grimly, and took a good look around the supply closet. Let's put on those white medical coats, he said. Maybe if we look like doctors, we can get into the ward. We can use these surgical masks in the pocket to hide our faces, just like Olaf's associate did at the lumber mill.
Quagmire,
Sunny said doubtfully, which meant when the Quagmires used disguises, they didn't fool Olaf. But when Olaf used disguises, Klaus said, he fooled everyone.
Us,
Sunny said. Except us, Klaus agreed. But we don't have to fool ourselves.
True,
Sunny said, and reached for 2 white coats. Because most doctors are adults, the white coats were far too big for the children, who were reminded of the enormous pinstripe suits Esme Squalor had purchased for them when she had been their guardian. Klaus helped Sunny roll up the sleeves of her coat, and Sunny helped Klaus tie his mask around his face, and in a few moments the children were finished putting on their disguises. "Let's go," Klaus said, and put his hand on the door of the supply closet. But he did not open it. Instead he turned back to his sister, and the 2 Baudelaires looked at each other. Even though the siblings were wearing white coats and had surgical masks on their faces, they did not look like doctors. They looked like 2 children in white coats, with surgical masks on their faces. Their disguises looked spurious, a word which here means nothing at all like a real doctor. And yet they were no more spurious than the disguises that Olaf had been using since his first attempt to steal the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus and Sunny looked at one another and hoped that Olaf's methods would work for them and help them steal their sister. And without another word, they opened the door and stepped out of the supply closet.
South?
Sunny asked, which meant, but how are we going to find the surgical ward when the maps of this hospital are so confusing? We'll have to find someone who's going there, Klaus said. Look for somebody who looks like they're on their way to the surgical ward.
Silata,
Sunny said. She meant something along the lines of, but there are so many people here, and she was right. Although the volunteers fighting disease were nowhere to be seen, the hallways of Heimlich Hospital were full of people. A hospital needs many different people and many different types of equipment in order to work properly, and as Klaus and Sunny tried to find the surgical ward, they saw all sorts of hospital employees and devices hurrying through the halls. There were physicians carrying stethoscopes, hurrying to listen to people's heartbeats, and there were obstetricians carrying babies, hurrying to deliver people's children. There were radiologists carrying X-ray machines, hurrying to view people's insides, and there were optic surgeons carrying laser-driven technology, hurrying to get inside people's views. There were nurses carrying hypodermic needles, hurrying to give people shots, and there were administrators carrying clipboards, hurrying to catch up on important paperwork. But no matter where the Baudelaires looked, they couldn't see anyone who seemed to be hurrying to the surgical ward. "I don't see any surgeons," Klaus said in desperation.
Papix,
Sunny said, which meant,
me neither.
"Out of my way, everybody!" demanded a voice at the end of the hallway. "I'm a surgical assistant, carrying equipment for Dr. Flacutono." The other employees of the hospital stopped and cleared the way for the person who had spoken. A tall person, dressed in a white lab coat and a surgical mask, who was coming down the hallway in odd, tottering steps. "I've got to get to the surgical ward right away," the person called, walking past the Baudelaires without even glancing at them. But Klaus and Sunny glanced at this person. They saw beneath the bottom hem of the white coat the pair of shoes with stiletto heels that this person was wearing, and they saw the handbag in the shape of an eye that the person was holding in one hand. The children saw the black veil of the person's hat, which was hanging in front of the surgical mask, and they saw blotches of lipstick which had soaked through from the person's lips and was staining the bottom of the mask. The person, of course, was pretending to be a surgical assistant, and she was carrying something that was pretending to be a piece of surgical equipment, but the children did not need more than a glance to see through both of these spurious disguises. As they watched the person tottering down the hallway, the 2 Baudelaires knew at once that she was really Esme Squalor, the villainous girlfriend of Count Olaf. And as they looked at the thing she was carrying, glinting in the light of the hospital hallway, the 2 Baudelaires knew that it was nothing more than a large rusty knife with a long row of jagged teeth, just perfect for a cranioectomy. Chapter 10. At this point in the dreadful story I am writing, I must interrupt for a moment and describe something that happened to a good friend of mine named Mr. Sirin. Mr. Sirin was a lepidopterist, a word which usually means a person who studies butterflies. In this case, however, the word lepidopterist means a man who is being pursued by angry government officials. And on the night I am telling you about, they were right on his heels. Mr. Sirin looked back to see how close they were. 4 officers in their bright pink uniforms with small flashlights in their left hands and large nets in their right, and realized that in a moment they would catch up and arrest him and his 6 favorite butterflies, which were frantically flapping alongside him. Mr. Sirin did not care much if he was captured. He had been in prison 4.5 times over the course of his long and complicated life, but he cared very much about the butterflies. He realized that these 6 delicate insects would undoubtedly perish in bug prison, where poisonous spiders, stinging bees, and other criminals would rip them to shreds. So, as the secret police closed in, Mr. Sirin opened his mouth as wide as he could and swallowed all 6 butterflies whole, quickly placing them in the dark but safe confines of his empty stomach. It was not a pleasant feeling to have these 6 insects living inside him, but Mr. Sirin kept them there for 3 years, eating only the lightest foods served in prison, so as not to crush the insects with a clump of broccoli or a baked potato. When his prison sentence was over, Mr. Sirin burped up the grateful butterflies and resumed his lepidoptery work in a community that was much more friendly to scientists and their specimens. I am telling you this story not just to reveal the courage and imagination of one of my dearest friends, but to help you imagine how Klaus and Sunny felt as they watched Esme Squalor, disguised as an associate of Dr. Flacutono, walk down the hallway of Heimlich Hospital carrying the long, rusty knife disguised as a surgical tool to be used on Violet. The 2 youngsters realized that their only chance of finding the surgical ward and rescuing their sister was to try and fool this greedy and stiletto-heeled villain. But as they approached her, like Mr. Sirin during his 5th and final prison sentence, the 2 Baudelaires felt the unpleasant fluttering of butterflies in their stomachs.
"Excuse me, Mom,"
Klaus said, trying to sound less like a 13-year-old boy and more like someone who had graduated from medical school.
Did you say you were an associate of Dr. Flacutono?
"If you're someone with a hearing problem,"
Esme said rudely, "don't bother me. Go to the ear ward."
"I'm not someone with a hearing problem," Klaus said. "This woman and I are associates of Dr. Flacutono."
Esme stopped in the middle of stabbing the floor and stared down at the 2 siblings. Klaus and Sunny could see her eyes shining behind the veil of her fashionable hat as she regarded the children before replying. "I was just wondering where you were," she said. "Come along with me and I'll take you to the patient."
"Patsy,"
Sunny said.
"What she is saying," Klaus said quickly, "is that we're very concerned about Laura V. Bleedioti."
"Well, you won't be concerned for long," Esme replied, leading the children around a corner to another hallway. "Here, you carry the knife." The evil girlfriend handed Klaus the rusty blade and leaned in closely to talk to him. "I'm glad you 2 are here," she whispered. "The brat's little brother and sister haven't been captured yet, and we still don't have the file on the Snicket fires. The authorities removed it for their investigation. The boss says we might have to torch the place."
"Torch?"
Sunny asked. "Mattathias will take care of that part," Esme said, looking around the hallway to make sure no one could hear them. "All you have to do is assist with the surgery. Let's hurry up." Esme walked up a stairway as fast as her shoes could carry her, and the children followed nervously behind her, Klaus holding the rusty, jagged knife. With every door they opened, every hallway they walked down, and every staircase they ascended, the youngsters were afraid that at any moment Esme would see through their disguises and realize who they were. But the greedy woman was too busy pausing to yank the blades of the stiletto heels out of the floor to notice that the two additional associates of Dr. Flacutono bore a very strong resemblance to the children she was trying to capture. Finally, Esme led the Baudelaires to a door marked Surgical Ward, which was being guarded by someone the children recognized at once. The guard was wearing a coat which read Heimlich Hospital and a cap that had the word Guard printed on it in big black print, but Klaus and Sonny could see that this was another spurious disguise. The siblings had seen this person at Damocles Dock, when poor Aunt Josephine had been their guardian, and they'd had to cook for this person when they'd been living with Count Olaf. The spurious guard was an enormous person who looked like neither a man nor a woman, and who had been assisting Count Olaf with his nefarious schemes for as long as the Baudelaires had been escaping from them. The person looked at the children, and the children looked back at him or her, certain that they would be recognized, but Olaf's assistant merely nodded and opened the door. "They've already anesthetized the bratty orphan," Esme said, "so you ladies merely need to go to her room and bring her to the operating theater. I'm going to try to find that sniveling bookworm and that stupid baby with the oversized teeth. Mattathias says I get to choose which one to keep alive in order to force Mr. Poe to give us the fortune, and which one I get to rip to shreds." "Good," Klaus said, trying to sound fierce and villainous. "I'm tired of chasing those kids around." "Me too," Esme said, and the enormous assistant nodded in agreement. "But I'm sure this will be the last time. Once we've destroyed the file, nobody can accuse us of any crimes. And once we murdered the orphans, the fortune will be ours." The villainous woman paused and looked around her to make sure no one was listening, and then, satisfied that no one could hear her, she laughed wildly in triumph. The enormous assistant laughed too, an odd laugh that sounded like a squeal and a howl at the same time, and the two Baudelaire youngsters tilted back their masked faces and made noises as if they were laughing too, although their laughter was as spurious as their disguises. Klaus and Sonny felt more like being sick than laughing, as they pretended to be as greedy and evil as Count Olaf and his troop. It had never occurred to the children how these terrible people acted when they didn't have to pretend to be nice, and the two siblings were horrified to hear all the bloodthirsty things Esme had said. Watching Esme and the enormous assistant laugh together made the butterflies in the Baudelaire stomachs flutter all the more, and the youngsters were relieved when Esme finally stopped laughing and ushered the children into the surgical ward. "I'll leave you ladies in the hands of our associates," she said, and the Baudelaires immediately saw with horror what she meant. Esme shut the door behind them, and the children found themselves facing two more of Count Olaf's wicked associates.
"Why, hello there,"
the first one said in a sinister voice, pointing at the two children with an odd-looking hand. One of the fingers was curved at an odd angle, while the others hung limp, like socks hung out to dry, and Klaus and Sonny could see at once that this was the associate of Olaf who had hooks instead of hands, wearing rubber gloves to hide his unusual and dangerous appendages. Behind him was a man whose hands were not as familiar, but Klaus and Sonny recognized him just as easily, due to the hideous wig he was wearing on his head. The wig was so limp, white, and curly that it looked like a heap of dead worms, which is not the sort of wig one forgets. The children had certainly not forgotten it from when they had been living in Poultryville, and realized at once that this person was the bald man with the long nose, who had been assisting Count Olaf since the Baudelaire's troubles began. The hook-handed man and the bald man with the long nose were among the nastiest members of Olaf's troop, But unlike the majority of nasty people on this earth, they were also quite clever, and the two young siblings felt the butterfly feeling in their stomachs increase exponentially, a phrase which here means get much, much worse, as they waited to see if these two associates were clever enough to see through the children's disguises.
I can see through your disguise,
the hook-handed man continued, and placed one of his spurious hands on Klaus's shoulder.
Me too,
the bald man said.
But I don't think anyone else will. I don't know how you ladies managed to do it, but you look much shorter in those white coats.
And your faces don't look as pale in those surgical masks,
the hook-handed man agreed.
These are the best disguises Mattathias, has ever cooked up.
We don't have time for all this talking, Klaus said, hoping that the associates wouldn't recognize his voice either. We've got to get to room 922 right away.
You're right, of course,
the hook-handed man said.
Follow us.
The two associates began walking down the hallway of the surgical ward, as Klaus and Sonny looked at one another in relief.
Quit,
Sonny murmured, which meant they didn't recognize us either. I know, Klaus replied in a whisper. They think we're the two powder-faced women, disguised as associates of Dr. Flacutono, instead of two children disguised as the two powder-faced women, disguised as associates of Dr. Flacutono.
Stop all that whispering about disguises, the bald man said. If anyone hears you, it'll be the end of us.
Instead of the end of Laura V. Bleediotti,
the hook-handed man said with a sneer.
I've been waiting to get hooks on her since she escaped from marrying Mattathias.
Trapped,
Sonny said, sneering as best she could.
Trapped is right, the bald man said. I already gave her the anesthetic, so she's unconscious. All we have to do is lead her to the operating theatre, and you can saw her head off.
I still don't understand why we have to murder her in front of all those doctors,
the hook-handed man said.
So it can look like an accident, you idiot,
the bald man snarled in reply.
I'm not an idiot,
the hook-handed man said, stopping to glare at his fellow associate.
I'm physically handicapped.
Just because you're physically handicapped doesn't mean you're mentally clever, the bald man said.
And just because you're wearing an ugly wig, the hook-handed man said, doesn't mean you can insult me.
Stop all this arguing, Klaus said. The sooner we can operate on Laura V. Bleediotti, the sooner we'll all be rich.
Yes,
Sonny said. The two criminals looked down at the Baudelaires and then nodded at one another sheepishly.
The ladies are right,
the hook-handed man said.
We shouldn't behave unprofessionally just because it's been a very stressful time at work.
Oh, no,
the bald man said with a sigh.
It seems like we've been following these three orphans forever, only to find them slip out of our grasp at the last minute. Let's just focus on getting the job done and work out our personal problems later. Well, here we are.
The four disguised people had reached the end of a hallway and were standing in front of a door marked Room 922, with the name Laura V. Bleediotti scrawled on a piece of paper and taped beneath. The bald man took a key out of the pocket in his medical coat and unlocked the door with a triumphant grin.
Here she is, he said, our little sleeping beauty.
The door opened with a long, whiny creak, and the children stepped inside the room, which was square and small and had heavy shades over the windows, making it quite dark inside. But even in the dim light, the children could see their sister, and they almost gasped at how dreadful she looked. When the bald associate had mentioned a sleeping beauty, he was referring to a fairy tale that you have probably heard 1,000 times. Like all fairy tales, the story of Sleeping Beauty begins with "Once upon a time," and continues with a foolish young princess who makes a witch very angry, and then takes a nap until her boyfriend wakes her up with a kiss and insists on getting married, at which point the story ends with the phrase, "happily ever after." The story is usually illustrated with fancy drawings of the napping princess, who always looks very glamorous and elegant, with her hair neatly combed and a long silk gown keeping her comfortable as she snores away for years and years. But when Klaus and Sunny saw Violet in room 922, it looked nothing like a fairy tale. The eldest Baudelaire was lying on a gurney, which is a metal bed with wheels, used in hospitals to move patients around. This particular gurney was as rusty as the knife Klaus was holding, and its sheets were ripped and soiled. Olaf's associates had put her into a white gown as filthy as the sheets, and had twisted her legs together like vines. Her hair had been messily thrown over her eyes so that no one would recognize her face from the daily punctilio, and her arms hung loosely from her body, one of them almost touching the floor of the room with one limp finger. Her face was pale and empty as the surface of the moon, and her mouth was open slightly in a vacant frown, as if she were dreaming of being pricked with a pin. Violet looked like she had dropped onto the gurney from a great height, and if it were not for the slow and steady rise of her chest as she breathed, it would have looked like she had not survived the fall. Klaus and Sunny looked at her in horrified silence, trying not to cry as they gazed at their helpless sister.
"She's a pretty one," the hook-handed man said, "even when she's unconscious."
She's clever, too, the bald man said, although her clever little brain won't do her any good when her head has been sawed off.
"Let's hurry up and go to the operating theatre," the hook-handed man said, beginning to move the gurney out of the room. "Mattathias said the anaesthetic would last for only a little while, so we'd best start the cranioectomy."
"I wouldn't mind if she woke up in the middle of it," the bald man said with a giggle, "but I suppose that would ruin the plan. You ladies take the head end. I don't like to look at her when she's frowning like that."
"And don't forget the knife," the hook-handed man said. "Dr. Flacutodo and I will be supervising, but you two will actually perform the operation."
The two children nodded, afraid that if they tried to speak, the two henchmen would hear how anxious they were and become suspicious. In silence they took their places at the gurney, where their sister lay without moving. The Baudelaires wanted to gently shake her by the shoulders, or whisper in her ear, or even just brush the hair away from her eyes, anything at all to help their unconscious sibling. But the two youngsters knew that any affectionate gesture would give away their disguise, so they just walked alongside the gurney, clutching the rusty knife, as the two men led the way out of room 922 and through the halls of the surgical ward. With every step, Klaus and Sunny watched their sister carefully, hoping for a sign that the anesthesia was wearing off, but Violet's face remained as still and blank as the sheet of paper on which I am printing this story. Although her siblings preferred to think about her inventing abilities and conversational skills rather than her physical appearance, it was true, as the hook-handed man had said, that Violet was a pretty one. And if her hair had been neatly combed instead of all tangled up, and she had been dressed in something elegant and glamorous instead of a stained gown, she might indeed have looked like an illustration from Sleeping Beauty. But the two younger Baudelaires did not feel like characters in a fairy tale. The unfortunate events in their lives had not begun with once upon a time, but with the terrible fire that had destroyed their home. And as Olaf's associates led them to a square metal door at the end of the hallway, Klaus and Sunny feared that their lives would not end like a fairy tale either. The label on the door read Operating Theatre, and as the hook-handed man opened it with one curved glove, the two children could not imagine that their story would end with happily ever after. Chapter 11. Operating theatres are not nearly as popular as dramatic theatres, musical theatres, and movie theatres, and it is easy to see why. A dramatic theatre is a large, dark room in which actors perform a play, and if you are in the audience, you can enjoy yourself by listening to the dialogue and looking at the costumes. A musical theatre is a large, dark room in which musicians perform a symphony, and if you are in the audience, you can enjoy yourself by listening to the melodies and watching the conductor wave his little stick around. And a movie theatre is a large, dark room in which a projectionist shows a film, and if you're in the audience, you can enjoy yourself by eating popcorn and gossiping about movie stars. But an operating theatre is a large, dark room in which doctors perform medical procedures, and if you are in the audience, the best thing to do is to leave at once, because there is never anything on display in an operating theatre but pain, suffering, and discomfort. And for this reason, most operating theatres have been closed down, or have been turned into restaurants. I'm sorry to say, however, that the operating theatre at Heimlich Hospital was still quite popular at the time this story takes place. As Klaus and Sonny followed Olaf's two disguised associates through the square metal door, they saw that the large, dark room was filled with people. There were rows of doctors in white coats who were clearly eager to see a new operation being performed. There were clusters of nurses sitting together and whispering with excitement about the world's first cranioectomy. There was a large group of volunteers fighting disease who seemed ready to burst into song if needed. And there were a great many people who looked like they had simply walked over to the operating theatre to see what was playing. The four disguised people wheeled the gurney onto a small, bare stage, lit by a chandelier that was hanging from the ceiling, and as soon as the light of the chandelier fell on Klaus and Sonny's unconscious sister, all of the audience members burst into cheers and applause. The roar from the crowd only made Klaus and Sonny even more anxious, but Olaf's two associates stopped moving the gurney, raised their arms, and bowed several times.
"Thank you very much,"
the hook-handed man cried.
"Doctors, nurses, volunteers fighting disease, reporters from the Daily Punctilio, distinguished guests, and regular people. Welcome to the operating theatre at Heimlich Hospital. I am Dr. O. Lucafont, and I will be your medical host for today's performance."
Hooray for Dr. Lucafont!
A doctor cried, as the crowd burst into applause again, and the hook-handed man raised his rubber-gloved hands and took another bow.
"And I am Dr. Flacky Turner,"
the bald man announced, looking a bit jealous of all the applause the hook-handed man was getting.
"I am the surgeon who invented the cranioectomy, and I'm thrilled to operate today in front of all you wonderful and attractive people." "Hooray for Dr. Flacky Turner,"
a nurse shouted, and the crowd applauded again. Some of the reporters even whistled as the bald man bowed deeply, using one hand to hold his curly wig on his head.
"The surgeon is right," the hook-handed man said. "You are wonderful and attractive, all of you. Come on, give yourselves a big hand."
"Hooray for us!"
a volunteer cried, and the audience applauded another time. The two Baudelaires looked at their older sister, hoping that the noise of the crowd would wake her up, but Violet did not move.
"No. The two lovely ladies you see are two associates of mine named Dr. Takuna and Nurse Flo," the bald man continued. "Why don't you give them the same wonderful welcome you gave us?"
Klaus and Sonny half expected someone in the crowd to shout, "They aren't medical associates, they're those two children wanted for murder." But instead the crowd merely cheered once more, and the two children found themselves waving miserably at the members of the audience. Although the youngsters were relieved that they hadn't been recognized, the butterflies in their stomachs only got worse as everyone in the operating theatre grew more and more eager for the operation to begin.
And now that you've met all of our fantastic performers, the hook-handed man said, let the show begin. Dr. Flacutono, are you ready to begin?
I sure am,
the bald man said.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you know, a cranioectomy is a procedure in which the patient's head is removed. Scientists have discovered that many health problems are rooted in the brain, so that the best thing to do with a sick patient is remove it. However, a cranioectomy is as dangerous as it is necessary. There is a chance that Laura V. Bleediotti might die while the operation is being performed, but sometimes one must risk accidents in order to cure illness.
A patient's death would certainly be a terrible accident, Dr. Flacutono, the hook-handed man said.
It sure would, Dr. O. Lucafont, the bald man agreed. That's why I'm going to have my associates perform the surgery while I supervise. Dr. Takuna and Nurse Flo, you may begin.
The crowd applauded once more, and Olaf's associates bowed and blew kisses to each corner of the operating theatre as the two children looked at one another in horror.
What can we do?
Klaus murmured to his sister, looking out at the crowd.
We're surrounded by people who expect us to saw Violet's head off.
Sunny looked at Violet, still unconscious on the gurney, and then at her brother, who was holding the long, rusty knife Esme had given him.
Stall,
she said. The word stall has two meanings, but as with most words with two meanings, you can figure out which meaning is being used by looking at the situation. The word stall, for example, can refer to a place where horses are kept, but Klaus knew at once that Sunny meant something more along the lines of, "We'll try to postpone the operation as long as we can, Klaus," and he nodded silently in agreement. The middle Baudelaire took a deep breath and closed his eyes, trying to think of something that could help him postpone the cranioectomy, and all at once he thought of something he had read. When you read as many books as Klaus Baudelaire, you are going to learn a great deal of information that might not become useful for a long time. You might read a book that would teach you all about the exploration of outer space, even if you do not become an astronaut until you are 80 years old. You might read a book about how to perform tricks on ice skates, and then not be forced to perform these tricks for a few weeks. You might read a book on how to have a successful marriage, when the only woman you will ever love has married someone else, and then perished one terrible afternoon. But although Klaus had read books on outer space exploration, ice skating tricks, and good marriage methods, and not yet found much use for this information, he had learned a great deal of information that was about to become very useful indeed.
Before I make the first incision, Klaus said, using a fancy word for cut in order to sound more like a medical professional, I think Nurse Flo and I should talk a little bit about the equipment we're using.
Sunny looked at her brother quizzically.
Knife,
she said.
That's right, Klaus said. It's a knife, and we all know it's a knife, Dr. Takuna.
The hook-handed man said, smiling at the audience, as the bald man leaned in to whisper to Klaus.
What are you doing?
He hissed.
Just saw off the brat's head and we'll be done. A real doctor would never perform a new operation without explaining everything,
Klaus whispered back.
We have to keep talking, or we'll never fool them.
Olaf's associates looked at Klaus and Sunny for a moment, and the two Baudelaires got ready to run, dragging Violet's gurney with them, if they were recognized at last. But after a moment's hesitation, the two disguised men looked at each other and nodded.
I suppose you're right,
the hook-handed man said, and then turned to the audience.
Sorry for the delay, folks. As you know, we're real doctors, so that's why we're explaining everything. Carry on, Dr. Takuna.
The cranioectomy will be performed with a knife, Klaus said, which is the oldest surgical tool in the world.
He was remembering the section on knives in A Complete History of Surgical Tools, which he had read when he was 11.
Early knives have been found in Egyptian tombs and Mayan temples where they were used for ceremonial purposes and mostly fashioned out of stone. Gradually, bronze and iron became the essential materials in knives, although some cultures fashioned them out of the incisors of slain animals.
Teeth,
Sunny explained. There are a number of different types of knives, Klaus continued, including the pocket knife, the pen knife, and the drawing knife. But the one required for this cranioectomy is a Bowie knife, named after Colonel James Bowie, who lived in Texas.
Wasn't that a magnificent explanation, ladies and gentlemen?
The hook-handed man said.
It sure was,
one of the reporters agreed. She was a woman wearing a grey suit and chewing gum as she spoke into a small microphone.
I can see the headline now. Doctor and Nurse Explain History of Knife. Wait until the readers of Daily Punctilio see that!
The audience applauded in agreement, and as the operating theatre filled with the sounds of cheers and clapping, Violet moved on her gurney ever so slightly. Her mouth opened a little wider, and one of her limp hands stirred briefly. The motions were so small that only Klaus and Sunny noticed them, and they looked at one another hopefully. Could they keep stalling until the anesthesia completely wore off?
Enough talk, the bald man whispered to the children. It's lots of fun fooling innocent people, but we better get on with the operation before the orphan wakes up.
Before I make the first incision, Klaus said again, continuing to address the audience as if the bald man hadn't spoken, I would like to say a few words concerning rust. He paused for a moment and tried to remember what he had learned from a book entitled What Happens to Wet Metal, which he had received as a gift from his mother. Rust is a reddish-brown coating that forms on certain metals when they oxidize, which is a scientific term for a chemical reaction occurring when iron or steel comes into contact with moisture. He held up the rusty knife for the audience to see, and out of the corner of his eye he saw Violet's hand move again, just barely. The oxidation process is integral to a cranioectomy due to the oxidative processes of cellular mitochondria and cosmetic demystification, he continued, trying to use as many complicated words as he could think of.
Clap,
cried Sunny, and the audience applauded once more, though not as loudly this time.
Very impressive,
the bald associate said, glaring at Klaus over his surgical mask.
But I think these lovely people will understand the process better once the head has actually been removed.
Of course, Klaus replied. But first we need to tenderize the vertebrae so we can make a clean cut. Nurse Flo, will you please nibble on on Laura V. Bleedioti's neck?
Yes,
Sunny said with a smile, knowing just what Klaus was up to. Standing on tiptoe, the youngest Baudelaire gave her sister a few small nibbles on the neck, hoping that it would wake Violet up. As Sunny's teeth scraped against her skin, Violet twitched and shut her mouth, but nothing more.
What are you doing?
The hook-handed man demanded in a furious whisper.
Perform the operation at once, or Mattathias will be furious.
Isn't Nurse Flo wonderful?
Klaus asked the audience, but only a few members of the crowd clapped, and there was not a single cheer. The people in the operating theatre were clearly eager to see some surgery, rather than hear any more explanations.
I believe you've bitten her neck enough,
the bald man said. His voice was friendly and professional, but his eyes were gazing at the children suspiciously.
Let's get on with the cranioectomy.
Klaus nodded and clasped the knife in both hands, holding it up over his helpless sister. He looked at Violet's sleeping figure and wondered if he could make a very small cut on Violet's neck, one that could wake her up but wouldn't injure her. He looked at the rusty blade, which was shaking up and down as his hands trembled in fear. And then he looked at Sonny, who had stopped nibbling on Violet's neck and was looking up at him with wide, wide eyes. "I can't do it," he whispered, and looked up at the ceiling. High above them was a square intercom speaker that he had not noticed before, and the sight of the speaker made him think of something. "I can't do it," he announced, and there was a gasp from the crowd. The hook-handed man took a step toward the gurney and pointed his limp, curved glove at Klaus. The middle Baudelaire could see the sharp tip of his hook poking through the finger of the glove like a sea creature emerging from the water.
"Why not?"
the hook-handed man asked quietly. Klaus swallowed, hoping he still sounded like a medical professional instead of a scared child. "Before I make the first incision, there's one more thing that has to be done. The most important thing we do here at Heimlich Hospital."
"And what is that?"
the bald man asked. His surgical mask curled down as he gave the children a sinister frown, but Sonny's mask began to curl in the opposite direction as she realized what Klaus was talking about and began to smile.
"Paperwork," she said,
and to the Baudelaire's delight, the audience began to applaud once more.
"Hooray!"
called a member of VFT from the back of the operating theatre as the cheering continued. "Hooray for paperwork!" Olaf's two associates looked at one another in frustration as the Baudelaires looked at one another in relief. "Hooray for paperwork indeed!" Klaus cried. "We can't operate on a patient until her file is absolutely complete."
"I can't believe we forgot about it, even for a moment," a nurse cried. "Paperwork is the most important thing we do at this hospital."
"I can see the headline now," said the reporter who had spoken earlier. "Heimlich Hospital almost forgets paperwork." Wait until the readers of the Daily Punctilio see that. "Somebody call Hal," suggested a doctor. "He's in charge of the Library of Records, so he can solve this paperwork problem."
"I'll call Hal right now,"
announced a nurse, walking out of the operating theatre, and the crowd clapped in support of her decision.
"There's no need to call Hal,"
said the hook-handed man, holding up his hooked gloves to try to calm the crowd.
"The paperwork has been taken care of. I promise you."
"But all surgical paperwork has to be verified by Hal," Klaus said. "That's the policy of Heimlich Hospital." The bald man glared down at the children and spoke to them in a frightening whisper.
"What in the world are you doing?" he asked them. "You're going to ruin everything."
"I think Dr. Takuna is right," another doctor said. "That's the policy here." The crowd applauded again, and Klaus and Sonny looked at one another. The two Baudelaires, of course, had no idea what the hospital's policy was concerning surgical paperwork, but they were beginning to see that the crowd would believe just about anything if they thought it was being said by a medical professional.
"Hal is on his way,"
the nurse announced, re-entering the room.
"There's apparently been some problem at the Library of Records, but he'll come as quickly as he can and settle this matter once and for all."
"We don't need Hal to settle this matter once and for all," a voice said from the far end of the theatre, and the Baudelaires turned to see the slender, tottering figure of Esme Squalor, walking straight toward them in her stiletto-heeled shoes, with two people trailing dutifully behind her. These two people were both dressed in medical coats and surgical masks, just like the Baudelaires. Klaus and Sonny could see just a bit of their pale faces above the masks, and knew at once that they were the two powder-faced assistants of Olaf. "This is the real Dr. Takuna," Esme said, pointing to one of the women, "and this is the real Nurse Flo. The two people up on this stage are imposters."
"No, we're not,"
the hook-handed man said angrily.
"Not you two,"
Esme said impatiently. glaring over her surgical mask at the two henchmen.
I mean the other two people on the stage. They fooled everyone. They fooled doctors, nurses, volunteers, reporters, and even me. Until I found the real associates of Dr. Fleckutono, that is. In my medical opinion, Klaus said, I believe this woman has lost her mind. I haven't lost my mind, Esme said with a snarl. But you're about to lose your heads, Baudelaires. Baudelaires? The reporter from the Daily Punctilio asked. The same Baudelaires who murdered Count Omar? Olaf, the bald man corrected. I'm confused, whined a volunteer. There are too many people pretending to be other people. Allow me to explain, Esme said, stepping up on the stage. I am a medical professional, just like Dr. Fleckutono, Dr. O. Lucafont, Dr. Takuna, and Nurse Flo. You can see that from our medical coats and surgical masks. Us too, Sonny cried. Esme's surgical mask curled up in a wicked smile. Not for long, she said, and in one swift gesture she ripped the masks off the Baudelaire's faces. The crowd gasped as the masks fluttered to the ground, and the two children saw the doctors, nurses, reporters, and regular people in the crowd look at them in horror. Only the volunteers fighting disease, who believed that no news was good news, did not recognize the youngsters. They are the Baudelaires, a nurse exclaimed in astonishment. I read about them in the Daily Punctilio. Me too, cried a doctor. It's always a pleasure to hear from our readers, the reporter said modestly. But there were supposed to be 3 murderous orphans, not 2, another doctor said. Where's the oldest one? The hook-handed man hurriedly stepped in front of the gurney, shielding Violet from view.
She's already in jail,
he said quickly. She is not, Klaus said, and brushed Violet's hair out of her eyes so that everyone could see she was not Laura V. Bleediotti. These terrible people disguised her as a patient so they could cut her head off. Don't be ridiculous, Esme said. You're the one who was trying to cut her head off. Look, you're still holding the knife. That's true, the reporter cried. I can see the headline now. Murderer attempts to murder murderer. Wait until the readers of the Daily Punctilio see this. Chweem, Sonny shrieked. We're not murderers, Klaus translated frantically. If you're not murderers, the reporter said, holding out her microphone, then why have you sneaked into a hospital in disguise? I think I can explain that, said another familiar voice, and everyone turned to see Hal enter the operating theatre. In one hand he was clutching the ring of keys the Baudelaires had made from paper clips and Violet's hair ribbon, and with the other hand he was pointing angrily at the children. Those 3 Baudelaire murderers, he said, pretended to be volunteers in order to come to work in the Library of Records. They did, a nurse said, as the audience gasped. You mean they're murderers and phony volunteers? No wonder they didn't know the words to the song, a volunteer cried. Taking advantage of my poor eyesight, Hal continued, pointing at his glasses. They made these fake keys and switched it with the real one so they could sneak into the library and destroy the files about their crimes. We didn't want to destroy the file, Klaus said. We wanted to clear our names. I'm sorry we tricked you, Hal, and I'm sorry that some of the file cabinets were knocked over, but... Knocked over? Hal repeated. You did more than knock over cabinets. He looked at the children and sighed wearily, and then turned to face the audience. These children committed arson, he said. The Library of Records is burning as we speak. Chapter 12. I am alone this evening, and I am alone because of a cruel twist of fate, a phrase which here means that nothing has happened the way I thought it would. Once I was a content man, with a comfortable home, a successful career, a person I loved very much, and an extremely reliable typewriter, but all of those things have been taken away from me, and now the only trace I have of those happy days is the tattoo on my left ankle. As I sit in this very tiny room, printing these words with this very large pencil, I feel as if my whole life has been nothing but a dismal play, presented just for someone else's amusement, and that the playwright who invented my cruel twist of fate is somewhere far above me, laughing and laughing at his creation. It is not pleasant to feel this way, and it is doubly unpleasant if the cruel twist of fate happens to you when you are actually standing on a stage, and there is actually someone far above you, laughing and laughing, as it was with the Baudelaire children in the operating theatre of Heimlich Hospital. The children had scarcely heard Hal's accusation that they had burned down the library of records when they heard rough and familiar laughter coming out of the intercom speaker above them. The siblings had heard this laughter when Mattathias had first captured the Quagmire triplets, and when he had trapped the Baudelaires in a locked deluxe cell. It was the triumphant laughter of someone who has cooked up a fiendish plot and succeeded, although it always sounded like the laughter of someone who has just told an excellent joke. Because he was laughing over the scratchy intercom, Mattathias sounded as if he had a piece of aluminum foil over his mouth, but the laughter was still loud enough to help wear off the anesthesia, and Violet murmured something and moved her arms.
"Oops,"
Mattathias said, interrupting his laughter as he realized the intercom was on.
"This is Mattathias, the head of human resources, with an important announcement. There is a terrible fire in Heimlich Hospital. The fire was set in the library of
Fear is the emotional response to love, and these seem to be the emotions with which we start life.
I wanna be the moon. 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 In the dead of night, I'll shine my light. So you know everything's gonna be alright. I wanna be the moon. I like to be alone. 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 It's scary to see you falling for me. I wish that I could be. I wanna be the moon. 'Cause I like you. I like you. I really do. I like you. But all of your love, your kisses
Stimpy, I'm so happy! I must go do nice things!
I like that you like the same cartoons that I do. We have such similar taste in children's media. You know what they say about how art can imitate life? Well, they were right, and our lives are a whole lot like the Ren and Stimpy Show. It's the Ren and Stimpy Show. Oh, what do you know? It's a brand new episode of the Ren and Stimpy Show. La 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 la. Now between you and me, you are Ren and I am definitely Stimpy. I say some silly shit, then you call me an idiot. Then we brush our teeth and go to sleep in the same bed. It's the Ren and Stimpy Show. It's the Ren and Stimpy Show. Oh, what do you know? It's a brand new episode of the Ren and Stimpy Show. La 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 la. We are the best of friends. Although it seems a little weird that we're together, but you're gonna see we'll be happy, you and me. Oh, so happy, 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 joy, joy, just like in the Ren and Stimpy. The daughter of the fish and the ram said, I am who I am, and what I am is a freak of nature. The daughter of the ram and the fish always had one secret wish, that someone would love her someday. But who could love someone with scales and horns? A girl who was cursed since the day she was born. She cried and she whined and she hated herself. She said maybe if I tried I could be someone else. So the daughter of the fish and the ram visited a magical clam, the oldest and wisest creature in the sea. She said, magical clam, take pity. I only want to be pretty. And the clam scratched his shell, and he told her, I will give you this magical pearl. It'll grant any wish that you have in the world. But even the magic that I possess can never bring you true happiness. You gotta take care of that yourself, said the clam. So the power of the magical pearl turned her into a beautiful girl, and she swam ashore and crawled up on dry land. But all of the people she met said, why is this girl soaking wet? And they laughed at her, and they called her weird. Sure, she might not have been ugly anymore, but she was just as lonely as
she was before. So crying, the girl fled back to the sea, and she asked the clam, why won't your magic work on me? The clam in his wisdom replied, it's the person you are inside, that's the problem, my dear. Sadly, you were doomed from the start. There's an incurable longing in your heart, and not even magic can fix that. 'Cause you miss the ocean when you're on land, and when you're in the water, you miss the sand. Trust me, my darling, take this time to roam, 'cause no one you meet is gonna make you feel like you're home. So even though she didn't really like it, she took the clam's advice and set out on a journey all by herself. And all of the wonders she saw filled her with humility and awe, and she felt right at home wherever she roamed. Her hooves let her climb to the highest peaks, and her gills let her swim to the bottom of the sea. And they still called her strange, but she didn't really mind. She was strange, she was strong, she was doing just fine. She was strange, she was strong, she was doing just fine. The daughter of the ram and the fish still hasn't gotten her wish, but not all of us do. Maybe someday she'll find somebody curious and kind to wander with her. But till then she's okay with just being alone. Some things you just have to find on your own. Sorry if my story leaves something to be desired. My fins are so sore and my hooves are so tired. My fins are so sore and my hooves are so tired. My fins are so sore and my hooves are so tired.
I'm freaking out. I don't know what to talk about. I'm losing my mind, so I hope you're fine with just sitting around. I wish I knew what to say to you. I can't cope, and this silly hope is all I'm hanging on to.
does my heart always break? When I see you go, I don't really know what difference it makes. I'm too shy. I'm too shy. And I get so down, 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 down when you're not around, round, 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 round. I get so down, 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 down. I get so down, 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 down.
Now I don't know.
Now I don't know.
But I've been told.
But I've been told.
That's true of everything I think I know. Everything I think I don't know.
That I don't know.
But I've been told.
But I've been told.
Yes, I've been told.
I don't even know how to begin. I don't even know who I am. I'm not here. No one is here. I stay awake most every night, waiting for a glimpse to appear. Where's my
Oh, that's my name.
It's a beautiful name.
Old-fashioned, you don't hear it a lot anymore.
The color is so light, what's it made of?
An old breastbone,
Creepy.
it was the breastbone of her sister. Her name was Pearl. I'll tell you the story. Rose and Pearl lived by the sea, gathering salt in the moonlight. And Rose loved a man who lived in the trees. Rose cried to Pearl, hold me tight, hold me tight. Rose went to his treehouse and looked at the stars through his telescope. She wanted to hold his hand, so she wrote him a poem, signed it and sealed it in a rice paper envelope
With a lily for a stamp.
but the man stole her work. He was the editor of a prestigious astronomy journal. He wrote down all she saw and published it in his name. And Rose grew to hate him, and then Pearl caught his eye.
I'm a little confused and more than a little frightened.
It's okay, my dear. This is a circular story. And so Rose ran into the forest and asked a great bear to maul the astronomer and to turn the cruel sister into a black crow and put the corpse and the crow in a cave till the crow started to starve and she'd have no choice but to peck out the eyes of her lover and eat them.
I don't believe any of this.
Don't you remember the bear named his price?
One pot of honey, one piece of stardust, one secret baptism, and a photo of a ghost. One pot of honey, one piece of stardust, one secret baptism, and a photo of a ghost.
Rose stole the honey from a soldier she pretended to love. Stole stardust from an ancient she pretended to care. And for the baptism, she stole a baby from its mother, a frightened teenager in a mansion, and took the child into the sea. And the child was blessed.
When I was a baby, I was blessed by a stranger in waters I didn't understand. And now I'm infected with disbelief and blasphemy. I'll never have a holy land. I am a ghost in the eyes of my God. But I will transcend and vomit this loser out of me. I will become the next big thing. I will light myself on fire. It's time to get out of bed and be the star child I can be. A billion light years away, someone's thinking the same thing, but he's already turned to dust. And the starlight I see is a billion light years old, a ghost just like the rest of us. transcend and vomit this loser out of me. I will become the next big thing. I will light myself on fire. It's time to get out of bed and be the star child I can be.